Hello there and welcome to History for Lunatics. I'm so glad you're here tonight. Find somewhere comfortable if you can. Maybe you have the lights low already. Maybe you are listening while the room settles down around you, or while the rest of the house has gone quiet. Tonight we're going somewhere that most people think they understand because they have seen the photographs. Men standing in breadlines with their collars turned up. Mothers looking at the camera with worry in their faces. Children in patched clothes outside a shack made from scrapboards and tin. We know the images. They have become almost too familiar, but tonight we are not going to rush past them. We are not going to treat hunger in the Great Depression as a symbol, or a paragraph in a textbook, or a black and white photograph with a caption underneath it. We are going to step inside it slowly, carefully, and look at what it meant to live through hunger in the United States when the cupboards went quiet. When a meal stopped being something you expected and became something you hoped could be arranged, stretched, borrowed, traded for, stood in line for, or simply done without. This is not a story about one disaster arriving all at once. Hunger during the Great Depression did not knock on every door in America on the same morning. It moved differently. In some homes, it began as a smaller supper. In others, it began with a father coming home early from work and saying there had been a layoff. In some places, it started with a bank closing, and the money that a family thought was safe simply not being available anymore. In farm country, it might have started with prices falling so low that a crop could not pay for the seed, the mule feed, the land note, or the taxes. In a city apartment, it might have started with the rent being due, and no wages coming in. It was not always dramatic at first. Sometimes the first sign was ordinary enough that a child might not even notice it. A mother scraping the last bit of lard from a tin and putting the tin back in the cupboard, though there was nothing left in it. A pot of beans made thinner than usual. Coffee made from grounds used one time too many. A father saying he was not very hungry, though everyone at the table knew he had worked all day looking for work. That was one of the cruelest things about Depression hunger. It often arrived wearing the clothes of thrift, and thrift was something American families already respected. Use it up, wear it out, make do not complain. Those were not slogans invented for hard times. They were habits that many families already lived by. But during the 1930s, those habits were pushed past thrift and into survival. There is a difference between saving leftovers because it is sensible and saving potato peelings because they may be needed. There is a difference between stretching a meal and pretending a meal has happened. Tonight, we are going to spend time with that difference. We are going to look at the American kitchen when the paycheck stopped, the lunch pail when there was nothing to pack, the schoolroom where teachers could tell which children had not eaten, the bread line where men waited quietly because they did not want anyone to see what waiting cost them, and the farms where food could exist in the field and still not save the family that grew it. Before we go further, I want to ask you something simple. Where are you listening from tonight? Are you in a room with a refrigerator humming somewhere nearby? Is there a kitchen down the hall with a light over the stove? Maybe a loaf of bread on the counter? Maybe a few cans in a cabinet that you barely think about because they are always there? It is worth noticing that. Not in a guilty way and not in a sentimental way, but in a real way. Because one of the hardest things to understand about hunger is how quickly the ordinary world can become strange. A cupboard is just a cupboard until you open it and there is no plan inside. A grocery store is just a grocery store until you walk past it, because you cannot buy anything. A dinner table is just furniture until it becomes the place where everyone watches everyone else pretend not to count the portions. If this kind of storytelling speaks to you, if you like history told slowly, with room to sit inside the details, it would mean a great deal if you subscribed and gave this video a like. You do not have to do it right now. Do it when something in the story makes you pause or think about your own family or look at your own kitchen a little differently. And if you want to share where you're watching from, a city, a small town, a couch, a bedroom, a bus ride home, leave it in the comments. I do read those, and there is something quietly fitting about people from different places gathering around a story about what people once did. when gathering itself was sometimes the only comfort they had. Now let us go back. Not to the moment everyone remembers, not to the stock market floor with men shouting and paper moving and prices collapsing, but to the ordinary home a little later, after the headlines had already done their damage and the effects were beginning to move through neighbourhoods. The year is 1931, or maybe 1932. The exact year matters less than the feeling of it, because by then the shock of 1929 had turned into something heavier and harder to escape. At first, many people had believed the trouble would pass. Americans had lived through downturns before. Factories slowed, then started again. Men lost jobs, then found them. Prices fell, then recovered. People told themselves this was another dip in the road. But as months became years, the explanations grew thinner. Banks failed. Savings vanished. Businesses that had survived earlier panics shut their doors. Construction stopped. Factories cut hours, then cut men, then closed entirely. By the worst years of the Depression, roughly 1 out of every 4 workers in the United States was unemployed, and that number does not fully capture the people working only a few hours, the people taking any task for any wage, the people selling apples on street corners, the people doing laundry, repairs, hauling, sewing, or odd jobs in exchange for food because a regular job had become something almost mythical. For a family living through it, the economy was not a chart. It was breakfast. It was whether there was enough coal for the stove. It was whether the shoes could be resoled one more time. It was whether the baby got milk, whether the oldest boy stayed in school, whether the rent could be delayed, whether pride could be swallowed without choking on it. Hunger did not exist separately from those decisions. It was woven through all of them. You might imagine hunger as a sharp pain, and of course it could be. But much of Depression hunger was slower than that. It was a tiredness in the afternoon. It was children losing weight through the winter. It was a mother watering soup and calling it stew. It was a man walking miles to ask about work because he could not afford the streetcar fare, then returning with nothing but more appetite than he had left with. It was the way people stopped inviting neighbours to eat because there was not enough to offer, and the way neighbours sometimes came anyway with a cabbage, a sack of flour, or a little meat wrapped in paper, saying they had extra, though everyone knew extra was not the right word. To understand this hunger, we have to understand how ordinary families ate before the worst of it. Many working-class households in the 1920s were not wealthy, but they had routines. A wage earner might bring home enough for rent, coal, bread, milk, potatoes, beans, coffee, maybe some meat on certain days, maybe fruit when it was cheap, maybe a Sunday meal that gave the week a little dignity. Food was plain in many homes, but plain is not the same as absent. Bread, gravy, potatoes, cabbage, oatmeal, cornmeal mush, beans, rice, onions, canned tomatoes, salt pork, bacon ends, soup bones, stale bread, fried in drippings, pancakes without much butter, coffee stretched with chicory or roasted grains in some families. These were not luxuries, but they were the architecture of daily life. Then unemployment pulled out the supports. The food budget was usually one of the only parts of a household budget that could be adjusted immediately. Rent was rent. Debt was debt. Coal cost what it cost. Medicine, if needed, could not always be delayed. But food could be thinned. Meat could disappear. Milk could be bought for children only. Bread could become the centre of the day. A meal could become a bowl. A bowl could become a cup. A cup could become nothing, explained away by saying nobody felt like eating much in the heat, or everyone had eaten enough at noon, or tomorrow would be better. I want you to sit with the quiet intelligence required to manage that kind of scarcity. It was not simply a matter of having less, it was a daily calculation, and much of it fell on women. The person responsible for the kitchen had to know what was in the cupboard, what could be bought on credit, which grocer might still allow credit, which neighbour had a garden, which charity was distributing flour, how far one could walk for soup, whether a child could be sent to school without lunch and not be noticed, how to make stale bread edible, how to use sour milk, how to make potatoes stretch, how to save grease, how to cook beans without wasting fuel, how to feed a husband whose body needed strength to look for work while also feeding children whose bodies were still growing. There was no romance in this. It was not picturesque. It was work done under pressure by people who often felt they were failing even when they were performing small miracles of management. A woman could turn almost nothing into something and still feel ashamed because something was not enough. That shame matters. Hunger in the Great Depression was not only physical, it was social. America in the early 20th century had a strong belief in work, self-reliance, and the moral meaning of providing for one's family. Many people had been raised to believe that accepting help was something to avoid unless every other option had failed. So when the options failed, the help did not feel neutral. It felt like exposure. Standing in a breadline meant standing where others could see you standing. Asking for relief meant answering questions. Taking a basket from a charity meant letting a stranger know what your children lacked. Men who had worked for years, who had carried lunch pails and paid rent and bought shoes and brought home wages, found themselves waiting for soup in public. Women who had kept orderly homes found themselves explaining why there was no food. Children learned to read the room before asking for more. That is one of the details that appears again and again in memories from the time. Children noticed. They noticed when adults stopped eating. They noticed when the same meal returned again and again. They noticed when the milkman no longer came, when the grocer looked uncomfortable, when their mother said not to mention certain things at school. Some children remembered hunger as embarrassment more than pain. The empty lunchbox, the teacher who quietly arranged food, the smell of other children's sandwiches, the effort of pretending not to care, and children are very good at pretending when they sense that adults are already carrying too much. Now, not everyone in the United States went hungry during the Great Depression. That is important to say. There were families who kept jobs, families with savings, families on farms that could still feed themselves, families with relatives who helped, families whose suffering was real but not starvation. The Depression was uneven. It struck differently by region, race, occupation, family structure, and luck. Some people remembered it as lean years, others remembered it as a catastrophe. In African American communities where discrimination had already limited wages, jobs, housing, and access to relief, the Depression often deepened hardship that had existed long before 1929. In Mexican American communities, families faced hunger alongside pressure, raids, and repatriation campaigns that pushed many people, including some American citizens, toward Mexico during the 1930s. In rural areas, farmers could be surrounded by food and still be crushed by prices, debt, foreclosure, and drought. In cities, people might be close to bakeries, markets, restaurants, and warehouses and still go hungry because food within sight is not the same as food within reach. This is one of the central facts of the period. America did not suddenly become a country without food. It became a country where millions could not reliably claim the food that existed. Grain could be stored. Milk could be poured out when prices made selling it pointless. Crops could rot because transportation, markets, and money had broken down. Hunger was not just the result of empty fields. It was the result of an economy that had stopped connecting labour to wages and wages to bread. That is a cold sentence, but in a kitchen it became very warm and very personal. It became a mother telling a child to drink water and wait. It became a man turning his face away from a restaurant window. It became a family moving because the landlord had waited as long as he could. It became a girl, leaving school to help at home. It became boys riding freight trains in search of work, carrying hunger with them from one town to the next. It became people learning the geography of relief offices, missions, church basements, settlement houses, and soup kitchens. It became recipes written without abundance in mind. Depression cake with no eggs, no butter, and sometimes no milk. Milk toast, dandelion greens, bean soup, potato soup, bread soaked in coffee, cornmeal mush fried the next morning if there was enough left to slice. Everything used twice if it could be used twice. everything saved if it could be saved. A jar of bacon grease was not a quaint country detail. It was flavour, calories and cooking fat, and it mattered. The opening of this story begins with the cupboard because the cupboard is where hunger becomes visible before it is spoken. Imagine a small kitchen in a rented apartment in Chicago, Cleveland, New York, St. Louis, or Detroit. The floor is worn where people stand most often. There is a table that has seen years of elbows, bills, homework, mending and meals. The stove may burn gas if the family is fortunate. Coal or wood if not. A calendar hangs on the wall, maybe from an insurance company or a grocer. The day's newspaper is folded nearby, full of words like unemployment, relief, foreclosure, recovery, emergency, and all the other official terms that try to make private fear sound organised. A woman opens the cupboard. She already knows what is inside because she has checked it several times that day, but she opens it again anyway. There is a little flour, not enough to be careless with. There are beans, but not many. There may be a can of tomatoes saved for when things are worse, though everyone knows worse has become a moving line. There is salt. There is maybe cornmeal. There is coffee, or something being called coffee. The sugar is low. The lard tin has a smear at the bottom. On the table, a child is doing schoolwork or pretending to. Another child watches the cupboard because children watch cupboards in hard times. The father is not home yet. He has been out looking for work, which means he has spent the day being told no in different ways. No hiring, no positions. Come back next week. Leave your name. Too many men already waiting. The mother has to decide what supper will be before he returns, because the return of a hungry person into a hungry home requires preparation even when there is almost nothing to prepare. She can make biscuits if she uses the flour, but then the flour is gone. She can make soup if she uses the beans, but beans take time and fuel is not nothing. She can fry potatoes if there are potatoes, but perhaps those are needed tomorrow. She can send one of the children to a neighbour, but she has already borrowed twice. She can go to the grocer, but the grocer has been kind, and kindness is not the same as unlimited credit. So she waits a little longer, because waiting is also a household strategy. Waiting lets you see whether someone brings something home. Waiting lets hunger dull slightly. Waiting makes the evening shorter. There is nothing dramatic about that moment from the outside. No one would photograph it. No one would put it in a government report. But that moment, the quiet pause in front of an open cupboard, is one of the truest images of depression hunger. It is a person trying to make a decision that should not be so difficult. It is food becoming arithmetic. It is love becoming rationing. It is the household holding its breath. And this is where we have to begin, because before there were breadlines, before there were relief programs large enough to change the daily reality for many families, before the New Deal became a familiar phrase, hunger entered homes privately. People tried to solve it privately. They sold things. They pawned watches, wedding gifts, tools, radios, extra blankets, good coats, anything that could be exchanged for a little cash. They took in laundry. They rented out rooms. They moved in with relatives. They planted gardens and yards, vacant lots, and wherever soil could be claimed. They kept chickens where rules allowed, and sometimes where rules did not. They stretched flour with cornmeal. They watered milk. They patched clothes until the patches needed patches. They did not immediately think of themselves as part of a national tragedy. They thought of themselves as a family having a bad month, then a bad season, then a bad year. That is how history often feels while it is happening. Not like history, like Tuesday, like the rent is due Friday, like the baby needs shoes, like the pantry has to last until someone pays someone for something. Like the whole country may be in trouble, yes, but tonight the question is whether there is enough for supper. As we move into this world, I want to be careful not to make hunger seem noble. People sometimes talk about the Depression as if hardship automatically made everyone stronger, kinder, more grateful, more disciplined. Some people did become those things. Some people were already those things. But hunger also made people frightened. It made them tired. It strained marriages. It shortened tempers. It humiliated proud workers. It made children grow up too quickly. It forced choices that left marks long after the economy recovered. Many people who survived the 1930s carried habits for the rest of their lives that made perfect sense only if you knew what they had once feared. Saving string, saving jars, saving bread heels, never throwing away leftovers, keeping canned goods stacked in the basement, eating everything on the plate, distrusting banks, distrusting debt, feeling uneasy when the refrigerator looked empty. These were not quirks. They were memories stored as habits. A person who had once gone hungry might never again look at a full pantry casually. That is part of the legacy we're going to follow. Not only what hunger did to bodies, but what it did to memory, family behaviour, and the meaning of enough. For now, stay in that kitchen a little longer. The evening's coming down. Somewhere outside, men are still walking home from another day without work. Somewhere a line has formed outside a mission, and the people in it are pretending not to study one another's shoes. Somewhere a farmer is looking at a field that cannot save him. Somewhere a child is rehearsing what to say tomorrow if there is no lunch to bring to school. Somewhere a mother is closing a cupboard softly, not because the sound matters, but because in a hungry house even small noises can feel too sharp. The story of hunger in the Great Depression is not one story. It is millions of small domestic negotiations, repeated day after day, until the private struggle became too large to remain private. And the first place that change could be felt was not in Washington, not on Wall Street, not in the speeches, not in the slogans, but in the place where a family learned whether the day had provided enough to eat. The pantry, the stove, the table, the lunch pail, the empty pocket, the line outside in the morning, all of these are waiting for us now, and the next door we open is the one where ordinary families first began to understand that the trouble was not passing quickly, and that the quiet cupboard was becoming a sign of something much larger than one household's bad luck. The first thing many families noticed was not a number in the newspaper. It was not a stock ticker, not a banker's warning, not a speech from a politician, not some great public announcement that life had changed. For most ordinary Americans, the Great Depression arrived by way of smaller things. A foreman who would not meet a man's eyes, a shift cut from 6 days to 3, a factory whistle that stopped blowing in the morning, a grocer who quietly said he could not carry any more credit, a landlord who had waited twice already, a mother looking at the shelves and realizing that the household had entered a new kind of counting. Not counting what was needed, counting what could be avoided. That is how the crash moved into the kitchen. It came through wages first, then rent, then fuel, then food. And by the time it reached the pantry, it had already passed through every layer of pride a family had. The stock market crash of October 1929 has become the dramatic opening scene in the way we remember the Great Depression. We picture men on Wall Street, crowds outside the exchange, newspapers with heavy black headlines, fortunes erased in a few hours. That happened, and it mattered. But the family in a rented apartment in Toledo or Newark or Birmingham did not wake up the next morning instantly hungry, because stock prices had fallen. Many families did not own stocks at all. The crash was not a bell they heard clearly from their own kitchens. It was more like a tremor travelling through the ground beneath the whole country, reaching them later through banks, factories, stores, farms, wages, and fear. At first there was uncertainty. People asked whether it was a panic or a correction, a temporary trouble or a deeper sickness. Business leaders said confidence had to be restored. Newspapers printed statements meant to calm people down. Presidents and bankers spoke about recovery as if it were a train that had been delayed but was still expected. Ordinary people wanted to believe that. They had reasons to believe it. The United States had seen bad times before. There had been recessions, panics, crop failures, strikes, layoffs, and winters when work was thin. Families had survived those by tightening their belts and waiting for the cycle to turn. So in many homes, the first response was not despair, it was adjustment. Less meat this week, No new shoes yet. Repair the old coat, stretch the coal, put off the dentist, keep the children from asking too many questions, tell yourself that spring will be better, or summer, or surely by Christmas. That waiting period is one of the most important parts of the story, because it shows how hunger did not always begin as a catastrophe. It began as a negotiation with normal life. A man who still had a job might find his hours reduced. He came home with a smaller pay envelope and the family rearranged itself around it. Rent still had to be paid, light still had to be paid, coal or wood still had to be found. A child still needed lunch for school, a baby still needed milk. Food was where the cut could be made fastest, because the kitchen could absorb pain quietly for a while. A woman could turn cheaper food into a meal. She could use beans instead of beef, potatoes instead of bread, cornmeal instead of wheat flour, gravy instead of meat, water instead of milk in a recipe that once had milk. She could say supper would be lighter because lunch had been late, or because everyone had been eating too much lately, or because heavy food did not sit well in warm weather. There were 100 household explanations that allowed hunger to enter without being named. Naming it was hard. Naming it meant admitting that the family was no longer merely economizing. It meant admitting that the old rules no longer worked. A working person had done what the country asked. He had shown up, laboured, obeyed the clock, accepted the wage, and brought it home. A homemaker had done what the household required. She had cooked, saved, mended, managed, stretched, and kept the place going. If, after all of that, there was still not enough food, then something larger than personal discipline had failed. But people did not always have the language for that at first. Many blamed themselves. Men walked farther, asked at more gates, stood outside more factories. Women took in washing, ironing, sewing, boarders, children, anything that might bring in a little money. Families sold small possessions before they asked for help. A radio went first in one household, then a good lamp, then a watch, then tools that were not being used because there was no work to use them for. Some sold wedding silver if they had any. Many had nothing so fine to sell. They sold the extra blanket, the Sunday coat, the sewing machine if they were desperate enough, though selling a sewing machine could be like selling the possibility of making money later. Every object in the home began to have two meanings, what it had meant before and what it could bring now if taken to a pawn shop. The pantry changed in the same way. Food was not just food. It became a record of time remaining. A sack of flour was days. A bag of beans was a plan. A tin of lard was a form of security. Potatoes meant options. Coffee meant morale as much as nourishment. Sugar meant children could still be given something that felt like a treat, even if the treat was only bread with a little sweetness on it. When those things ran low, people felt it before anyone spoke. A quiet pantry can make a room feel different. Doors open more carefully. Scoops are levelled with more attention. Children are told not to waste crumbs. The heel of a loaf is saved because it can become thickener for soup or crumbs for a pan. Grease is poured into a jar and kept. Bones are boiled longer. Tea leaves or coffee grounds are used again. The spoon scrapes the pot in a way everyone hears. None of these acts were new inventions of the 1930s. Poor and working families had always practiced forms of economy. What changed was the scale and duration. The old tricks were meant to carry a household through a rough week or a thin season. During the Depression, the rough week did not end. That was the discovery that settled over people slowly. A household could live on beans and bread for a while. A man could look for work for a while. A grocer could extend credit for a while. Relatives could share for a while. Charity could help for a while. But the months kept moving. Savings, if there had been any, disappeared. Credit tightened. Relatives were in trouble too. Employers who had promised to call did not call. The word temporary lost its comfort. In some homes, the pantry went quiet after a bank failed. This is another part of the Depression that can feel almost impossible to understand today unless we slow down and picture it properly. A bank was not an abstract institution to a small family. It might hold the savings from years of labour, the emergency money, the rent money, the money meant for seed, tools, a child's schooling, a small business account, a widow's cushion, a farmer's hope of making it through the next season. When banks failed, depositors could lose everything or be unable to withdraw what they needed. Imagine standing outside a closed bank with a crowd of other people, reading a notice on the door, knowing that the money inside is yours and also not yours in any useful sense. Then imagine going home and explaining that to people who need supper. That was not a financial inconvenience. It was food removed from the future. It was a winter coat not bought. It was a doctor not called. It was flour, potatoes and coal transformed into a locked door. Bank failures also spread fear beyond the people who lost money directly. If one bank could close, another could close. If one employer could fail, another could fail. Fear changed behaviour. People stopped spending. Businesses lost customers. Stores cut staff. Factories reduced production. Farmers received lower prices. Towns collected less in taxes. Schools and local governments strained. One person's saving, necessary and rational in a time of fear, became another person's lost wage. That is how an economic collapse becomes domestic. It enters through perfectly reasonable decisions made by frightened people, and by the time it reaches the dinner table, no one feels responsible enough to fix it alone. In industrial cities, families often felt the crash through the workplace first. A man who had once been tired at the end of a shift became tired from searching for a shift. There is a difference between those two kinds of exhaustion. Work tiredness has weight in it, but it also has proof. The body aches because the day produced something, even if the wage was small. Unemployment tiredness is different. It comes from walking, waiting, asking, being refused, trying not to show desperation, and coming home with nothing visible in the hands. Men carry that home with them. Some tried to keep regular hours, leaving in the morning as if going to work because staying in the house felt worse. Some rode streetcars until they could no longer justify the fare, then walked. Some read want ads that had already been answered by hundreds. Some waited outside factory gates before dawn because rumours travelled faster than official notices. If a plant needed 10 men, 100 might appear. If a foreman chose younger men, older men went home. If he chose the strongest, the smaller went home. If he chose men he knew, strangers went home. And all of them went home hungry, or nearly hungry, with the added burden of having to tell the family there was nothing yet. In the kitchen, the response had to be immediate. Supper could not wait for national recovery. A woman might begin with what she had and adjust as people came through the door. If her husband brought home a few coins from an odd job, she could send a child quickly for bread or milk. If he brought nothing, the meal changed shape. Soup became thinner. The bread was sliced narrower. Children were fed first, though not always openly. Adults had ways of giving food away without making a scene. A mother might say she had eaten earlier. A father might say he was too tired. An older sibling might claim not to like something. These small lies were sometimes acts of love. They were also evidence of how hunger rearranges truth. In a hungry house, people do not always say what they need. They say what keeps the table from becoming unbearable. One of the cruel details of these years is that hunger often increased at the same time that food became more visible in public life. Cities still had restaurants. Bakeries still produced smells. Markets still displayed goods. Trains still carried food. Advertisements still showed abundance. A hungry person in a city could pass windows full of things he could not buy. This kind of hunger has a special humiliation. It is not the hunger of an isolated wilderness where no food exists. It is hunger in the presence of food guarded by price. A loaf of bread behind glass can feel almost insulting when the difference between having it and not having it is a few cents no one has. Children noticed bakery smells. Men noticed diners. Women noticed the prices written in chalk. A cent or two mattered. A nickel mattered. A dime could change the evening. The loss of small money made small things enormous. The crash also reached rural families, though not always in the way city people imagined. Farmers were not automatically safe because they lived near fields and animals. Many had been struggling even before 1929. Agricultural prices had fallen during the 1920s after the boom of the First World War. Farmers who had borrowed to buy land, machinery or seed found themselves producing crops that sold for too little. After the crash, prices fell further. A farmer might have corn, cotton, wheat, milk or hogs, and still be unable to pay taxes, interest or store bills. Food could exist on the farm, but money was still needed for salt, flour if the family did not grow wheat, coffee, sugar, kerosene, tools, medicine, school supplies and mortgage payments. And when debt pressed hard enough, a farm family's food supply could not protect the farm itself. Foreclosure sales became scenes of pain and sometimes resistance. Neighbours would gather and bid pennies on a family's belongings so they could return them afterward, a practice that came from solidarity and anger. But not every family was saved that way. Some lost land, equipment, animals, and with them the structure that had made survival possible. For tenant farmers and sharecroppers, especially in the south, hunger could be even more severe. Many were already living under systems that left them in debt year after year. A crop failure, low prices, or the landlord's decision could mean there was little food and little control over what happened next. African American sharecroppers faced the added weight of racial violence, discrimination, and exclusion from many forms of fair treatment. Poor white tenants suffered too, but not within the same racial order. Hunger does not erase hierarchy, it often reveals it more sharply. Relief, credit, employment, and even sympathy were distributed through human systems, and those systems carried the prejudices of the time. A hungry black family in Mississippi or Georgia could not assume the same access to aid as a hungry white family. Mexican-American families in the Southwest and Midwest faced job loss and hunger alongside suspicion and official pressure to leave. Native communities, already shaped by long histories of dispossession and federal control, faced depression and hardship within conditions that had been produced over generations. To say Americans went hungry is true, but incomplete. Different Americans were made hungry in different ways, and some had far fewer doors to knock on. Still, across these differences, one shared pattern appeared again and again. Families tried to preserve normal life after the material basis for normal life had begun to vanish. They kept children in school as long as they could. They kept Sunday clothes clean. They kept curtains washed if there was soap enough. They set the table even when the table was poor. They continued birthdays with whatever could be managed. A cake without eggs might still be a cake if a candle could be found. A holiday meal might be beans dressed up with onion and a little bacon fat. People understood presentation. They understood that dignity could be damaged by hunger, and they fought that damage with small rituals, a clean tablecloth if one existed. Coffee offered to a visitor even if it was weak. Children told to wash before eating, even if the food was plain. These things did not fill the stomach, but they protected the household from feeling completely defeated. There is something very human in that. We often think survival is only about calories, shelter, and money, but people also need to feel that they have not become unrecognizable to themselves. Depression families work to remain families, not merely groups of hungry people under one roof. The pantry mattered because it was practical, but also because it represented a mother's competence, a father's wages, a family's planning, a household's respectability. When it emptied, it did not just remove food, it challenged the story the family had told about itself. That is why so many people hid hardship as long as possible. They did not want neighbours to know. They did not want children telling teachers. They did not want relatives to worry or judge. Some avoided relief because the process could feel degrading. Relief offices often required investigation. Applicants might be asked about income, possessions, relatives, rent, food, and spending. A visitor could inspect the home. To officials, these questions were a way of determining need. To families, they could feel like a trial. Imagine having to prove hunger while also trying to preserve pride. Imagine being asked what you own when what you own is already disappearing. Imagine knowing that a stranger's decision may determine whether there is flour in the house. It is easy now to say people should have accepted help sooner. It was harder then, inside a culture that had taught them to associate independence with moral worth. Some communities responded before governments did. Churches organised meals, clothing drives and grocery baskets. Ethnic associations helped members. Mutual aid societies, settlement houses, fraternal orders, women's clubs, unions and local charities stepped into the space between private suffering and public policy. Neighbours shared. But local charity was not built for a crisis this large. A church kitchen could feed some people, not an entire city. A charity could distribute baskets until donations ran out, and donations ran out faster when donors were also losing income. In the early years, much of the burden remained local because many leaders believed relief should be local and temporary. But hunger was becoming national and long-lasting. That mismatch created scenes that Americans had not expected to see in their own country. Lines outside missions, families evicted with furniture on the sidewalk, children fainting or undernourished, men sleeping in parks, under bridges, in shanty towns that came to be called Hoovervilles, by people who blamed President Herbert Hoover for not doing enough. The name carried anger, but also a kind of bitter humour. People named their suffering because naming gave them a way to speak back to power, even if it did not fill a bowl. In many homes, the first felt sign that things had changed was the disappearance of choice. Before the Depression, a poor family might still ask what to have for supper within a narrow range. During the worst times, the question became whether supper existed in any meaningful form. Potatoes again was not a preference. Beans again was not a preference. Bread and gravy again was not a preference. It was the answer. Children might complain at first, because children do, and because they did not yet understand the seriousness of the cupboard. But children learn quickly when adults become quiet. They learn not to ask for butter. They learn not to take the largest piece. They learn which foods are for the baby. They learn that lunch at school may be better than lunch at home, if the school has any programme or a teacher willing to intervene. They learn that a mother can make a plate look fuller by spreading food out. They learn that hunger before bed makes sleep slower. And they learn the sound of adults talking in low voices after they are supposed to be asleep. Those low voices were part of the Depression household. Parents planning, worrying, arguing quietly, doing arithmetic. Rent, coal, milk, bread, doctor, shoes, debt, relief, work, relatives. The same words returning, the same numbers not adding up. The children might not understand every detail, but they understood tone. A household under economic stress has a different sound. Doors close differently. Paper is folded differently. Chairs scrape harder or softer depending on the mood. The dinner table becomes a place of observation. Who is eating? Who is not eating? Is father angry? Is mother worried? Did someone mention the landlord? Did the grocer say anything? Are we moving? Will we have to leave school? Will there be breakfast? Hunger made children attentive in ways no child should have. To be attentive. It trained them to read scarcity on adult faces. For many families, the crash was first felt as a loss of rhythm. Work had given shape to the week. Payday gave shape to shopping. Shopping gave shape to meals. Meals gave shape to the day. When work vanished, the rhythm broke. Without payday, there was no proper market day. Without regular shopping, the pantry became irregular. Without enough food, meals lost their certainty. Breakfast might be coffee for adults and bread for children. Lunch might be skipped. Supper might be the only real meal or not real at all. Sunday might no longer feel different. Holidays might arrive like accusations. A calendar can become cruel when the household has no means to honour it. Yet people still tried. They tried because the pattern of life mattered. A Sunday dinner, however plain, could remind everyone that the family still existed as a family. A holiday pie made from almost nothing could carry more emotional weight than a feast in better times. Scarcity made small successes feel large. Finding a few eggs, getting day work, receiving a basket, harvesting a garden patch, discovering a cheaper butcher, stretching the flour one more week. These were not minor events. They were relief entering the body. They were the difference between dread and one night of sleep. I want to bring you back to one household, not because it represents every household, but because history becomes clearer when we let it sit in a room. It is late afternoon. The mother has already checked the pantry twice. There is half a loaf of bread, some potatoes softening in the bin, a little flour, a little salt, and a jar of grease. There may be onions if the family's lucky. The children are home from school. One has not eaten since morning. Another says nothing but watches the stove. Their father has been gone since early, looking for work at a warehouse where someone said hiring might begin. The mother knows better than to count on it, but she has counted on it anyway because hope is sometimes the only ingredient available. She peels the potatoes carefully, taking off as little as possible. The peelings are not wasted. If they cannot be cooked, they may be fed to an animal, if there is an animal, or saved for something else. She slices the potatoes thin so they seem more plentiful and cook faster. Fuel matters. Time matters. She melts a little grease in the pan, not enough to be generous, enough to keep the potatoes from sticking. If there is onion, she uses it because onion can make a poor room smell like something is happening. That smell is important. It tells the children supper exists. It tells the father when he opens the door that the house is still functioning. It tells her the same thing. The table is set. Not beautifully perhaps, but deliberately. Plates, if they have plates. Cups. Maybe no milk. Maybe water. Maybe weak coffee for adults. The father comes in. She can read the answer before he says it. No work. Maybe tomorrow. Maybe they said come back Monday. Maybe there were already too many men. He washes, or he does not. He sits, or he stands a moment too long. The children look at the food. The mother serves them first, or serves him first because he is the wage seeker and must keep strength, or serves in equal portions because equality is the only fairness left. Different families did this differently. There was no single rule except that every serving carried meaning. The potatoes are eaten slowly. Bread is used to wipe the plate. Someone makes a joke if the household still has the strength for jokes. Someone says the potatoes are good. That compliment matters more than it would in easier times. It acknowledges the work of making little appear as enough. Afterward, the dishes are washed with care because soap costs money, water may have to be heated, and everything in the kitchen has to be ready to do the same thing again tomorrow. That was the ordinary face of the crash inside a family. Not a collapse into chaos every night. Not melodrama, repetition, adjustment, worry, labour, a little luck, a little shame, a little humour where possible. The ongoing effort to make hunger less visible than it was. What makes this period so difficult to hold in the mind is that it contained both deprivation and resourcefulness, both public failure and private skill. Millions were failed by systems larger than themselves, but inside homes people still made decisions that mattered. They cooked, shared, lied gently, bargained, walked, waited, saved, borrowed, planted, prayed, organised, protested, applied for relief, refused relief, accepted relief, fed neighbours, were fed by neighbours. The pantry went quiet, but people did not. They found ways to keep moving because children wake up hungry whether the economy's working or not. Morning arrives whether the bank opens or not. A body needs food whether the factory hires or not. This is why the story cannot stay only in the kitchen. The kitchen shows us where the trouble was felt, but the hunger soon moved outward into streets, schoolrooms, churches, railroad yards, fields, and lines that formed before dawn. Once private cupboards could no longer carry the burden, hunger became visible in public. Men who had tried to hide their need stood shoulder to shoulder outside missions and municipal kitchens. Women waited for grocery orders from relief offices. Children received food from teachers who understood that lessons could not enter a hungry mind. Farmers watched markets fail them while city people stood near bakeries with empty pockets. The quiet pantry was only the beginning. Outside the home, the country was learning to stand in line, and the line itself would become one of the defining images of the decade, not because Americans had forgotten how to work, and not because they had suddenly become helpless, but because work, wages, and food had come apart in a way no single household could mend on its own. By the time hunger moved out of the kitchen and into the street, it had already passed through a long private process that most people around the family never saw. A man did not usually appear in a breadline the first morning he lost work. A mother did not usually go to a relief office the first week the pantry looked thin. Families tried other things first. They stretched, borrowed, pawned, skipped, waited, and hoped. They took meals with relatives when relatives still had meals to offer. They accepted small kindnesses from neighbours and returned them when they could. They told children that times were hard but temporary. They made old food serve new purposes. They sold what had once seemed permanent. Then, after enough days of that, after enough mornings when the search for work began before breakfast and ended without wages, the public line became less impossible than the empty room at home. That is the part we have to understand before we picture the breadline itself. The line was not just a place where food was given. It was the place where private struggle became visible. It was where a man who had spent years proving himself useful had to stand still and wait to be fed. It was where time changed its meaning. In ordinary life, waiting is an irritation. In depression life, waiting could become the work of the day. You waited for factory gates to open. You waited for a foreman to choose. You waited outside a relief office. You waited for a church basement to begin serving. You waited for a municipal kitchen to unlock its doors. You waited with hundreds of others, and sometimes the waiting began before the sun came up because a place in line could decide whether you ate hot food or only watched the supply run out. Imagine a city morning in 1932. It is still dark enough that windows reflect the street lamps. The air is cold, and the kind of cold matters, because hunger makes cold feel sharper. A body without enough food does not hold warmth well. The men in line know this, even if they would not describe it that way. They have coats, but not always good coats. Some collars are turned up, some hands are tucked under arms. Shoes are worn thin because shoes were one of the first things families tried not to replace. A man might have newspaper folded inside his shoes against the pavement. Another might have wrapped his feet with rags where socks had worn through. Some men have hats pulled low, partly against weather, and partly because a hat brim gives a little privacy in a public place. They stand close enough to hold their place and far enough apart to pretend they are not leaning on one another. No one wants to look desperate, though desperation is the reason they are there. The line begins outside a mission, a church, a municipal relief station, a private charity kitchen, or a restaurant back door where someone has arranged to distribute coffee and bread. In some cities, lines formed outside places run by the Salvation Army, Catholic charities, Jewish, relief organisations, settlement houses, churches and local committees that had been feeding people long before the federal government was prepared to do it on the scale required. In Chicago, one of the most famous soup kitchens was opened by Al Capone in 1930, serving meals to thousands of unemployed people, while newspapers understood perfectly well that charity could also be publicity. That detail is strange, but the Depression was full of strange arrangements. Respectable institutions failed to keep people fed, and sometimes food came from places that forced people to accept help without the comfort of moral clarity. A hungry man did not always get to choose the symbolism of the bowl placed in front of him. He chose whether to eat. What did a breadline meal look like? It depended on the city, the organisation, the donations available that week, and the number of people who arrived. Sometimes it was bread and coffee, sometimes soup. Sometimes stew if meat scraps, vegetables and bones had been secured, sometimes a donut or roll, sometimes beans, sometimes oatmeal in the morning. The food was usually plain, and plain was not an insult in itself. What mattered was heat, calories, and enough volume to quiet the body for a while. A cup of coffee could be weak, but it was warm. A bowl of soup could be thin, but it was something held in both hands. Bread could be stale, but bread was bread. People who have always had choices sometimes underestimate the meaning of warm food. In hard times, heat itself becomes part of the nourishment. A hot bowl tells the body that the world has not completely abandoned it. That is why so many memories of depression relief food mention steam, not flavour. Steam from soup, steam from coffee, steam rising in a room crowded with wet coats, tired men, and the smell of boiled vegetables. But to receive that bowl, you first had to stand. The standing could last hours. Some lines were orderly because the people in them made them orderly. Others were controlled by police or volunteers. Men knew there might not be enough for everyone, and that knowledge lived in the line from the beginning. A person near the front could feel ashamed and relieved at the same time. A person near the back could measure the movement of the line with the nervous attention of someone watching daylight fade. There were rumours in lines. A kitchen had run out yesterday. A church across town had better bread. A city office was issuing meal tickets if you got there early. A factory might be hiring near the river. Someone heard there was work loading coal. Someone else said no, that was finished. Information moved through hunger networks the way weather moves through farming communities. Men who had never spoken before traded small facts because a small fact could mean food. The line was humiliating, but it was also social. People learned faces. They recognised who had been there all week, who was new, who still had a decent coat, who had begun to look weaker. In the first days, a man might stand stiffly, separate from the others, determined to show that he did not belong. After a few weeks, the distinction became harder to maintain. The line had a way of absorbing people. It made the exceptional ordinary. That may have been one of its most painful effects. If everyone around you is hungry, your hunger is less lonely, but it is also harder to believe the world is functioning. A single hungry man can tell himself he has had bad luck. A line of 500 hungry men suggests something else has gone wrong. That is why breadlines became such a powerful image of the Depression. They were visual proof that the old promise had failed for too many people at once. Americans had been taught that work brought wages, wages brought food, and food made a household stable. The breadline showed a break in that chain. Many of the men waiting were not idle by temperament. They had worked in factories, on docks, in mines, on railroads, in construction, in hotels, in slaughterhouses, in stores and in offices. Some had been skilled workers, some had been veterans, some had supported families for decades. Their place in line was not evidence that they lacked discipline. It was evidence that discipline alone could not reopen a closed plant. This distinction mattered then, and still matters now. The Depression made visible a truth that many people resisted because it was uncomfortable. A person could be willing to work, able to work, and still not be able to find work. Hunger followed from that not as a moral lesson, but as a practical consequence. A loaf of bread did not care how proud you were. Rent did not adjust itself because you had tried hard. Children could not digest a father's good intentions. Relief food became necessary because private effort, though enormous, could not solve a national collapse. In the early years, that necessity was unevenly acknowledged. Some officials still believed too much relief would weaken character. Some communities worried about encouraging dependency. Others understood quickly that the problem was not laziness but scale. Breadlines forced the argument into public space. You could debate economics in a newspaper column, but it was harder to walk past hungry people every morning and insist nothing structural had happened. Not all breadlines were made of men, though the most famous photographs often show male faces. Women waited too, sometimes in separate lines, sometimes at relief stations, sometimes outside grocery distribution points rather than soup kitchens. Women with children faced a different kind of exposure. A man alone in a breadline could sometimes preserve the fiction that he was only between jobs, only passing through, only waiting until things turned. A woman asking for food for children had to reveal the household more directly. She might be questioned about the number of children, the husband's employment, relatives, rent, income and possessions. She might receive groceries rather than a meal. Flour, beans, canned goods, powdered milk, potatoes, or a food order redeemable at a store. That could be more useful than a bowl of soup, but it came with its own indignities. Relief often required proof of need, proof of residence, proof that you had no other support, proof that you were deserving. In a hungry home, being required to prove need could feel like being asked to perform your own failure for inspection. For children, public food had another meaning. A soup kitchen could be frightening, embarrassing, or strangely exciting depending on age and circumstance. A child might remember the smell of a mission hall, the scrape of benches, the size of the pot, the way adults spoke in lower voices there. Some children were sent to receive food because a child could wait when a parent was searching for work, or because a mother could not leave younger children at home. Others were kept away because parents wanted to protect them from the sight of public hunger. Schools became important places in this story because teachers saw what families tried to hide. A teacher could notice a child who stared at lunch, who fell asleep at a desk, who stopped playing at recess, who came without food day after day. In some communities, school lunches expanded or were improvised through local charity, parent groups, teachers' own money, or later government-supported efforts. But in the earliest and hardest stretches, many teachers did what people often did in the Depression. They quietly filled gaps before policy caught up. A sandwich placed on a desk without comment. Milk arranged through a local donor. A child asked to help in the kitchen and given food in a way that did not look like charity. Hunger was public, but kindness often worked best when it preserved a little privacy. Still, privacy was difficult to maintain in a line. A line has witnesses. It also has rules. You waited your turn. You did not push if you wanted to keep order and dignity. You did not complain too loudly because volunteers might be doing their best, and because complaint could sound like ingratitude even when the food was poor. You did not take more than allowed. Some people carried tins, cups, bowls or containers when food could be taken away. Others ate standing or at long tables. The meal itself could be over quickly after hours of waiting. That imbalance is hard to think about. 3 hours in the cold for 10 minutes with bread and soup, a morning spent for one bowl. But if that bowl was the meal, the arithmetic was not foolish. It was survival. The time spent waiting was time not earning, but when there was no earning to be had, waiting became the nearest substitute for productive action. It gave the day a task. It gave the hungry person a destination. It gave the body a reason to keep moving toward a door that might open. A breadline before dawn could be quiet in a way that makes modern people uncomfortable. We sometimes expect suffering to announce itself. In reality, much of it is silent because people are tired, cold, ashamed, or simply conserving energy. There may have been coughs, feet shifting, a few muttered conversations, the clink of a milk can or pot, the sound of a truck passing, the sweep of a streetcar, the distant start of a city that still had workers with jobs to go to. That contrast could be painful. Men in breadlines watched other men go to work. They saw lunch pails, they saw uniforms, they saw delivery wagons, they saw office clerks and shop girls and policemen and street sweepers, all moving within the old order of the day. A job gives a person a place to be that does not need explaining. The bread lane gave a place to be that explained too much. This is one reason unemployed men often continued to leave home early even when there was little hope of work. Staying home could make them feel useless. Leaving allowed the household to maintain the shape of work, even if the day ended in a relief line. A wife might pack nothing because there was nothing to pack, but the husband still put on a coat and went out. The children still saw him leave. Everyone could pretend the search itself was a kind of job, and in a sense it was. Looking for work during the Depression required stamina, knowledge, movement, and endurance. It simply did not pay. When no work appeared, the food line became the last appointment of the day or the first. Some men visited more than one place, learning schedules across the city. Coffee here in the morning, soup there at noon, bread somewhere else if you arrived before the crowd. This was not aimless wandering. It was a map of hunger memorized on foot. Black Americans experienced breadlines and relief through the added burden of discrimination. In many places, they were the first fired and the last hired. Charitable and public aid could be segregated, unequal, or administered through local officials who carried the prejudices of their communities. A black family facing hunger might have fewer relief options and more danger in pressing claims. In the South, sharecroppers and tenant farmers often dealt not with breadlines in city streets, but with commissaries, landlords, crop liens, and relief systems that could reinforce dependence. In northern cities, black workers stood in the same national crisis but not on equal ground. Mexican-American families, especially in the Southwest and industrial centres, also faced hunger alongside pressure from repatriation drives and job competition sharpened by racism. Some families avoided relief offices out of fear that accepting aid could make them targets for removal or scrutiny. Native communities faced depression hunger, within reservation economies already constrained by federal policies and long histories of dispossession. These distinctions matter because public hunger did not make America equal. A breadline could place men shoulder to shoulder, but the society around the line still decided who was treated with patience, who was suspected, who was served first, who was turned away, and whose suffering was considered normal enough to ignore. In large cities, the sight of breadlines challenged civic pride. American cities had built skyscrapers, factories, rail terminals, department stores, electric signs, and streets filled with the machinery of modern life. Yet outside those same symbols of progress, people waited for bread. The contradiction was hard to miss. It was possible to stand in a relief line within sight of an advertisement showing abundance, a smiling family at a breakfast table, a gleaming kitchen, a roast, a brand of coffee, a promise of comfort sold to people who could no longer buy it. Advertising did not stop during hunger. The consumer world continued to speak in the language of desire, while millions lived in the language of need. That contrast shaped the emotional experience of the Depression. People were not hungry in an empty world. They were hungry in a world that had recently told them prosperity was normal. The 1920s had advertised installment buying, radios, automobiles, appliances, packaged foods, and the expanding comforts of modern life. Then the 1930s asked people to stand in line for soup. The psychological fall was steep. It is one thing to be poor in a community where everyone has always expected scarcity. It is another to have just lived through a decade of public optimism and then find yourself counting bread slices in the dark. There were also rural versions of the breadline, though they did not always look like lines. A farm family might receive food through county relief, church baskets, neighbours, federal surplus distribution, or school programs. In some places, surplus commodities were distributed: flour, pork, beans, butter, or other staples when available. The irony was sometimes bitter. Farmers had produced food that markets did not reward, while hungry people needed food they could not buy. Later New Deal programs tried to address both farm prices and food distribution, though not without controversy and uneven effects. During the earlier crisis years, many rural people relied heavily on gardens, hunting, fishing, preserving, and kinship networks. But when drought struck the plains and the Dust Bowl years turned farms into places of blowing soil, hunger took on another form. There might be no bread line outside a mission, but there was a line of need stretching from failed crops to unpaid debts, to children eating what could be gathered, stretched, or sent by relatives. The city bread line became the famous image because it could be photographed in one frame. Rural hunger often dispersed itself across miles. That made it less visible, not less real. Back in the city, breadlines had their own etiquette. A new arrival learned quickly. Keep your place. Do not ask too many questions at the door. Have your ticket ready if tickets are used. Do not anger the person serving. Do not draw attention unless necessary. If you see someone you know, decide in a second whether to greet him, look away, or let him decide. That last detail is important. In a breadline, recognition could be painful. Meeting an old co-worker might bring comfort, but it might also confirm how far both of you had fallen. Seeing a neighbour could threaten the privacy your family had tried to maintain. People sometimes avoided certain relief sites because they feared being seen by someone from church, school, or work. Others preferred distant lines for that reason, walking farther to preserve the illusion at home that help had not been sought so publicly. Pride burns calories too, though no one can live on it. Some men eventually surrendered the effort to hide. Others never did. Hunger does not produce one kind of character. It reveals many. There were men who shared food from a line with someone weaker. There were men who lied to get a second portion. There were volunteers who served with tenderness. There were volunteers who served with contempt. There were officials who understood the scale of the disaster. There were officials who treated applicants as if need itself was suspicious. There were donors who gave quietly. There were donors who expected gratitude as payment. The breadline was not a simple scene of noble suffering and noble charity. It was a human place, which means it contained impatience, generosity, resentment, order, fear, humour, and small negotiations over dignity. Humour deserves a place here because it survived even in lines. Americans in the Depression made jokes about empty pockets, bad coffee, thin soup, Hoover blankets made of newspapers, Hoover flags meaning empty pockets turned inside out, and the strange new vocabulary of being broke. Humour did not erase hunger, but it made it speakable. A joke could allow a man to acknowledge need without sounding defeated. It could make the line less silent. It could turn anger away from the self and toward the situation. That mattered. People needed ways to keep shame from swallowing them entirely. Some sang, some told stories, some argued politics. Breadlines became places where opinions formed and hardened. A man who had never thought much about federal policy might develop strong views after weeks of waiting for meals while elected officials debated relief. Hunger educates quickly. It teaches the meaning of institutions, markets, wages, charity, and power in ways no classroom can. It also changes how people view time. Before hunger, morning might mean work, errands, school, cooking, cleaning, the ordinary machinery of the day. In a breadline, morning meant securing a place early enough. Dawn became practical. You arrived before light because the line would grow. You watched the door. You smelled food before seeing it. Smell could be both comfort and torment. Coffee brewing somewhere inside a building can become almost unbearable when your stomach is empty. Soup simmering behind a closed door can make minutes feel longer. When the door opened, the line moved, and movement itself brought relief. Not food yet, but the promise of food becoming more likely. Then came the bowl, cup, plate, or paper. The serving might be fast because many were waiting. Bread placed in hand, coffee poured, soup ladled, no lingering. A volunteer might say a kind word or nothing. A man might lower his eyes, say thank you and move along. He might eat too quickly and feel sick. He might save part of the bread for later or for someone at home. That was common enough to matter. Not every person in a breadline was feeding only himself. A man might carry food back to a wife, child, sibling, or older parent. A roll wrapped in newspaper could be a household contribution. That small act could help preserve his sense of usefulness. Even when receiving charity, he could still bring something home. But bringing relief food home also exposed the source of the meal. Everyone knew where it came from. The bread had a story, and the story was need. There were days when the line failed. Supplies ran out. The kitchen closed. A person arrived too late. A relief office changed rules. A ticket was invalid. A volunteer said, "Come back tomorrow." Tomorrow is a hard word when hunger is present today. Going home empty from a breadline could feel worse than never having gone, because waiting creates expectation. The body prepares itself. The mind promises the stomach. Then the promise breaks. On those days, a person might search for another line, another church, another mission, another chance at work, or simply walk to delay returning home. The walk itself became part of the hunger. City pavement took strength. Cold took strength. Disappointment took strength. By evening, the body had spent energy it could not replace. This is one of the overlooked cruelties of poverty. Securing help often requires labour from people who are already depleted. You stand in line because you are hungry, and standing makes you hungrier. You walk to find work because you need food, and walking consumes the food you did not have. The Depression was full of these traps. The public response grew over time because the old patchwork could not hold. Local governments strained under the number of people needing help. Private charities could not meet the demand. As the crisis deepened, pressure mounted for broader action. When Franklin Roosevelt took office in 1933, federal relief efforts expanded through programs that aimed not only to feed people directly, but to put them to work, because wages carried a dignity that soup alone could not provide. The Civilian Conservation Corps, Federal Emergency Relief Administration, Civil Works Administration, Works Progress Administration, and other programs did not erase hunger instantly, and they did not reach everyone fairly. But they changed the relationship between need and government. The breadline did not disappear overnight, but the idea that mass hunger could be answered only by private charity became harder to defend. The line had taught the country something, reluctantly and painfully. It had shown that when unemployment reached millions, hunger was not a private flaw. It was a public emergency. Even with broader relief, the emotional memory of the breadline remained. People who stood in those lines often carried the experience for the rest of their lives. Some rarely spoke of it. Others described it in fragments: the cold, the coffee, the shame, the long wait, the faces, the feeling of being one among many. A person might later have steady work, a full kitchen, grandchildren, a house with electric light and a refrigerator, and still save bread. Still arrive early, still dislike waste, still feel uneasy when money was not in cash, still remember the line not as a historical event but as a bodily memory. Hunger stores itself that way. It becomes a habit of caution. It becomes a refusal to throw away bones before boiling them. It becomes a shelf of cans. It becomes telling children to finish what they took because food is not a toy. It becomes silence when someone asks what the Depression was like. Because where do you begin? With the crash? With the layoff? With the soup? With the morning you saw your father in line? With the day your mother brought home flour from the relief office and cried where she thought no one could hear? The breadline is easy to picture from a distance, but the true weight of it is in the individual decisions that brought each person there. Each figure in the photograph had a morning before the photograph. He woke somewhere. He put on clothes that may have been brushed carefully even if worn thin. He may have checked on sleeping children before leaving. He may have told his wife he would look for work first, then stop for food only if necessary. He may have promised himself that this would be the last time. He may have believed that promise. Then he joined the line. Around him were others with their own versions of the same morning, and together they formed an image so strong that it still stands for the decade. But we should not let the image flatten them. They were not symbols to themselves. They were hungry people in real weather, waiting for a real meal, hoping the line would move before the pot emptied. Stay with that for a moment. The street is still dim. The first grey light has begun to show on the upper windows. The city is waking around the line. Somewhere a delivery truck rattles over the pavement. Somewhere a bakery door opens and sends out the smell of bread that not everyone can buy. The men shift forward a few inches. A volunteer unlocks a side door. Inside, cups are being stacked. A kettle is being stirred. Someone counts loaves. The line tightens, not with panic, but with attention. People who have waited a long time can sense when waiting is almost over. The first men enter. The rest follow slowly. A bowl is filled, handed across, received. Bread is placed beside it. Coffee is poured. The meal is simple enough that in another life someone might complain about it. Here, no one complains loudly. A man wraps one piece of bread to carry home. Another closes both hands around the coffee before drinking because the warmth matters. Another eats standing, eyes lowered, moving aside for the next person because the line outside is still long. This is how public hunger looked in the morning, not as one grand tragedy, but as a repeated motion. Wait, receive, eat, move on, and begin again tomorrow if nothing changes. And for many families, something else was happening while that line moved. Children were going to school with little or nothing in their stomachs. Mothers were planning meals around whatever might come back from relief. Teachers were beginning to understand that hunger did not stay politely at home. It sat at desks, slowed arithmetic, blurred reading lessons, made tempers shorter and bodies weaker. The breadline fed the person who could reach it, but hunger had already entered places where a bowl of soup at dawn could not fully follow, and the next part of the day belonged to the children who carried the depression into classrooms, lunchrooms, playgrounds, and the quiet shame of having nothing to unwrap when the other children opened their food. If the breadline showed hunger in public, the kitchen showed what hunger required in private. It was the room where relief food, borrowed food, garden food, leftover food, and almost food had to be made into something that could sit on a table without announcing too loudly how little there was. A line outside a mission could be photographed. A kitchen could not be understood so easily. The real work happened before the pot reached the stove, before the children were called, before anyone lifted a spoon. It happened in the deciding. What can be used tonight? What must be saved for tomorrow? What can be watered down without becoming insulting? What can be fed to the children without the adults eating much? What can be called supper because calling it nothing would hurt too much? During the Great Depression, many American kitchens became places of invention, but not the cheerful kind of invention people celebrate later in cookbooks. This was invention under pressure. It was the daily practice of looking at a potato, an onion, a spoonful of grease, a little flour, and the last of yesterday's beans and asking how long a family could be carried on that. The answer was often longer than anyone would have believed in easier times, though not without cost. There is a difference between being resourceful because you enjoy it and being resourceful because the alternative is a hungry child. The women who ran many of these kitchens, and sometimes older daughters, grandmothers, aunts, widowed fathers, or anyone else responsible for feeding a household, were not playing at simplicity. They were managing scarcity with no guarantee that tomorrow would bring more. The kitchen had to become a small accounting office, a workshop, a relief station, a school of thrift, and sometimes a place where adults quietly absorbed the panic so children would not have to carry all of it at once. The first rule was that nothing could be wasted. That sounds simple until you slow down and realize what nothing meant. Stale bread was not stale bread. It was crumbs, thickener, toast, pudding, stuffing if there was anything to stuff, or a way to give body to soup. Bacon grease was not a dirty leftover in a pan. It was stored in a jar and treated like a useful ingredient because it carried fat, salt, and flavour into foods that had almost none. Bones were not finished when the meat was gone. They were boiled until the water became broth, and if the broth was thin, it could still soften beans, cook rice, or make potatoes taste less bare. Potato water could be saved for bread or soup. Vegetable peelings might go into stock if they were clean enough and the family had fuel enough to boil them. Sour milk could become biscuits or pancakes if it had not spoiled too far. Leftover coffee might be reheated, stretched, or used in a cake when there were no eggs and very little else. The heel of a loaf, the last spoon of oatmeal, the scrap of onion too small to notice in better times, all of it entered the kitchen's mental ledger. You can tell a great deal about a hard time by what people stop throwing away. In a Depression kitchen, the trash itself shrank. A modern kitchen hides waste easily. Packages, peelings, leftovers forgotten in the back of a refrigerator, food bought with good intentions and thrown out without ceremony. In the 1930s, for many households, the idea of throwing away edible food was almost unthinkable. It was not because everyone had suddenly become morally pure, it was because edible food had become too important to lose. A pan was scraped clean, jars were rinsed and reused, paper sacks were saved, string was saved, tin cans could become containers, flour sacks became dish towels, underclothes, children's garments, quilt pieces, and anything else a needle could manage. The kitchen was connected to every other kind of household survival. Feeding people could not be separated from mending clothes, saving fuel, preserving heat, keeping children presentable, or making $1 perform the work of 3. When people later remembered Depression cooking, they often remembered a few foods with particular clarity. Beans, potatoes, cornmeal, cabbage, onions, rice, oatmeal, bread, flour gravy, soup that seemed to last forever. These were the foods that could stretch. Meat did not vanish from every table, but for many families it became rare, smaller, cheaper, or present mainly as flavour. Salt pork, bacon ends, neck bones, soup bones, liver, tripe, pig's feet, and other inexpensive cuts could appear where roasts had never been common, or had now become impossible. A small piece of meat might season an entire pot rather than sit at the centre of a plate. The older idea of meat as the proof of a proper meal had to bend. In some homes it broke completely. Gravy could stand in for meat when it had to. Flour browned in grease, water added, salt if available, pepper if there was pepper, and then poured over bread, biscuits, potatoes, or whatever starch was present. To someone who has never needed it, flour gravy can sound poor in the most literal sense. To a hungry person, it was warm, filling, and flavoured with whatever fat the household had managed to save. It turned bread into a meal. It gave children something that felt cooked. That mattered. Depression food was often about creating the feeling of a meal as much as the meal itself. A pot on the stove changed the room. A smell in the kitchen reassured people before a bite was taken. Even when the food was thin, the act of cooking told the household that someone was still fighting for order. Soup became one of the great tools of that fight. A soup pot could accept almost anything and forgive almost everything. Beans, potatoes, onions, cabbage, carrots if there were carrots, tomatoes if a can could be spared, rice, pasta pieces, corn, greens gathered by someone who knew what was safe, bones, drippings, salt, and long cooking. The problem was that long cooking required fuel, and fuel cost money too. This is one of those details that changes the way you think about the kitchen. Having dry beans is not the same as having cooked beans. Having a pot is not the same as being able to keep a stove going. Gas, coal, wood, kerosene, electricity in homes that used electric appliances, all of it had a cost or a supply limit. A family might choose foods not only by price, but by how much fuel they required. Quick cooking foods could be valuable even if they were less ideal nutritionally. Cornmeal mush cooked faster than some beans. Fried potatoes cooked faster if sliced thin. Bread needed baking unless bought. And buying bread cost money that homemade bread might save if flour and fuel were available. Every decision had another decision inside it. If you cook the beans today, do you use too much fuel? If you do not cook them, what feeds the family tonight? If the oven is heated, what else can be cooked at the same time so no heat is wasted? A woman might bake bread, cook a casserole, warm water, and dry a damp cloth near the stove because heat already purchased had to serve more than one purpose. A kitchen in hard times teaches efficiency not as a virtue, but as a condition of survival. Potatoes deserve their own place in this story because they were one of the most dependable foods in many poor households. They were filling, familiar, relatively cheap in many areas, and flexible enough to appear at breakfast, dinner and supper without changing their name too much. Boiled potatoes, fried potatoes, mashed potatoes without much milk or butter, potato soup, potato cakes made from leftovers, potatoes added to bread, potatoes stretched with cabbage, potatoes eaten with gravy. A sack of potatoes could feel like security. It sat in a bin, cellar, pantry or corner and promised meals ahead. But potatoes alone could not give a body everything it needed, and families knew this in practical ways even when they did not speak in modern nutritional language. Children needed milk, eggs, fruit, vegetables, and protein. Adults needed strength. Hunger was not always a complete lack of food. Sometimes it was a long imbalance. Too much starch, too little milk. Enough to stop the stomach from aching, not enough to build a child well. Teachers, nurses, settlement workers and doctors saw the effects. Thin arms, poor teeth, tiredness, illness that took hold more easily. The kitchen could invent dinner, but it could not invent all the nutrients missing from the economy. Milk was one of the painful markers of depression hunger. For families with small children, milk mattered deeply. It was also perishable and had to be bought regularly unless the family kept a cow, which city families did not, and many rural families could not rely on in the same way if they had lost animals or feed. A mother might buy milk for the youngest child and tell the older children they were too big to need it. She might water it down, she might save it for breakfast, she might use powdered or canned milk if available through relief or purchase. In some places, relief programs eventually included milk distribution, because child nutrition was so visibly at stake. But before help became steady, milk could disappear from the table quietly. Children who had once poured it over oatmeal might now eat oatmeal with water. Cocoa, if once made with milk, could become water, sugar, and memory. Butter was another food that could vanish or become too precious for daily use. Lard, drippings, margarine where available, or nothing at all took its place. Bread without butter is still bread, and that sentence became a kind of household fact. Bread itself carried enormous weight. Store bread, homemade bread, day-old bread, bakery ends, relief bread, bread from a line, bread made with flour from a government commodity allotment, bread stretched with cornmeal or potatoes. A loaf could be the centre of a day. Children could be given bread and something on it if something existed. Grease, gravy, molasses, jam, sugar, ketchup, or nothing. There were families who ate bread soaked in coffee, bread in milk when milk existed, bread fried in grease, bread as dumplings in soup. In immigrant households, older food traditions helped shape what scarcity looked like. Italian-American families might stretch pasta with sauce made from very little, use beans and greens, or rely on bread in familiar ways. Jewish families might turn to potatoes, onions, herring when available, barley, soup, and bread shaped by tradition and price. Southern families might use cornmeal, greens, beans, salt pork, sorghum, biscuits, and whatever could come from a garden, field, or neighbour. Mexican. American families might rely on beans, tortillas, rice, chilies, and garden produce when they could, though unemployment and discrimination made even staple foods uncertain. Black families in the South and in northern cities drew on deep traditions of making meals from inexpensive cuts, greens, cornmeal, beans, and collective sharing. But those traditions existed alongside severe inequality that made hunger heavier. Food culture did not disappear during the Depression. It adapted under stress. The same beans could mean different things in different kitchens depending on seasoning, memory, region, and what the family had known before hardship came. This is why we should be careful with the phrase depression food, as if the whole country ate one menu. There were patterns, yes, but not one table. A mining family in West Virginia, a tenant family in Alabama, a Polish family in Detroit, a Mexican-American family in Los Angeles, a Jewish family in the Bronx, a black family in Chicago, a wheat farm family in Kansas, and a fishing family in Maine could all be hungry in the 1930s. But their kitchens did not smell the same. Their recipes, tools, habits, and networks differed. What they shared was the need to stretch. Stretching is the most honest word for depression cooking. Meat stretched with beans, milk stretched with water, flour stretched with cornmeal, soup stretched with bread, a meal stretched over 2 days, $1 stretched until the paper almost tore in the mind. Even the appetite had to be stretched and trained. Eat slowly, drink water, wait, save some for later. Do not take more, do not ask. Children learned those lessons at the table, sometimes through instruction and sometimes by watching. A child could see when a mother gave herself the smallest serving. A child could see when a father praised a meal that did not fill him. A child could understand that asking for seconds might create pain in the room. These lessons did not always make children saintly. Hungry children fought, stole bites, cried, complained, and hid food too. They were children, not little monuments to endurance. But many became cautious around food in ways that lasted. The kitchen taught them that food could vanish, and that knowledge does not always leave when the pantry fills again. There were also foods that later became associated with depression ingenuity, because they sound almost unbelievable to people raised with abundance. Eggless, milkless, butterless cakes, sometimes made with raisins or spices when available, had roots before the Depression but fit the needs of the 1930s perfectly. Vinegar pie, water pie, mock apple pie, cracker pies, and other substitute desserts appeared in households that wanted a sweet ending without the usual ingredients. These foods can be presented today as charming curiosities, but in their own time they were solutions. A birthday needed a cake even if there were no eggs. A holiday needed a pie even if there were no apples. A child needed to feel remembered. Sugar, when available, could do emotional work far beyond its calories. Dessert in a poor household was not trivial. It could say that the family had not surrendered all ceremony. Even a strange pie made from pantry scraps could carry dignity if it was served with care. That is one of the complicated truths of Depression kitchens. People were not only trying to stay alive, they were trying to keep life recognizable. They made treats when treats were nearly impossible. They kept certain dishes for Sundays if they could. They saved a little coffee for company. They put food on plates instead of letting everyone eat from the pot when plates helped the meal feel proper. They used table manners even when the food was poor. They did this not because appearances were shallow, but because appearances can help a family remain intact. When the world outside says you are failing, the table can still say you belong here. The table can still say, wash your hands, sit down, pass the bread, say thank you, leave some for your brother. The rules may be strained, but the rules are a kind of shelter. Gardens became part of that shelter for many families. City gardens, backyard gardens, vacant lot gardens, school gardens, relief gardens, and rural kitchen gardens all mattered. A small patch could produce beans, tomatoes, greens, onions, carrots, potatoes, squash, or whatever the soil and climate allowed. A garden did not solve unemployment, but it gave a household something that did not require a grocer's permission once the seeds were found. Seeds themselves could be saved, traded, or distributed through relief efforts and community programs. Gardening also gave people work that produced visible results. That mattered psychologically. A man who had lost a factory job might dig a plot. Children might weed. Women might plan canning around whatever came in. The garden connected effort to food in a way the broken wage economy no longer did. But gardens were not magic. They required land, water, tools, seeds, knowledge, time, and weather. Apartment families without yards had fewer options. Drought-stricken families had soil, but not always crop success. Still, where gardens grew, they became part of the kitchen strategy. Fresh food during the growing season, preserved food afterward if jars, lids, fuel and equipment were available. Canning was another form of hope made practical. Rows of jars on a shelf could steady the mind. Tomatoes, beans, peaches, applesauce, pickles, jam if sugar could be spared, meat in some rural households with pressure canning knowledge and equipment, though safe preservation required skill. A jar of summer opened in winter was more than food. It was evidence that planning had worked at least once. In many rural homes, preserving had always been part of life, but the Depression made it more urgent. Home demonstration agents, extension services, women's clubs, and local relief efforts often promoted canning, nutrition, and budget cooking. Government and university experts issued advice on low-cost meals, balanced diets, and efficient food use. Some of that advice was useful. Some of it could feel distant from the reality of a woman who had no money for the recommended ingredients. A pamphlet might suggest milk, vegetables, cereals, and protein in proper amounts. The kitchen might answer with potatoes, flour, and a little grease. Expert advice can be correct and still difficult to use when the cupboard is nearly empty. But many women did use what help they could get. They attended demonstrations, exchanged recipes, clipped newspaper columns, and relied on neighbours for the practical version of food science. What fills a child? What does not spoil quickly? What can be made without eggs? What hides the taste of government flour if the flour is poor? What can be cooked in one pot? What to do when beans cause stomach trouble? How to make coffee last? How to feed extra relatives who have moved in? One of the great untold archives of the Depression is not only in government records or photographs, but in the recipes passed from kitchen to kitchen, often without being written down. Add more water. Use soda if the milk has turned. Save the potato water. Brown the flour first. Put the onion in early so the room smells better. Give the baby the milk. Tell the men there is more in the pot, even if there is not. These were not formal instructions. They were survival habits. Relief commodities changed some kitchens as the 1930s went on. Federal efforts to purchase and distribute surplus food helped connect agricultural abundance with human need, though unevenly and imperfectly. Families might receive flour, beans, rice, dried fruit, canned meat, butter, cheese, or other staples depending on place and program. The arrival of a relief package could transform a day. Flour meant bread, biscuits, gravy, pancakes, dumplings. Beans meant several meals if cooked carefully. Rice meant bulk. Canned meat meant protein and flavour. But relief food also came with stigma. Children knew when a sack came from relief. Neighbours might know. The food could be welcome and humiliating at the same time. A woman could be grateful for flour and ashamed of needing it. She could resent the quality and still use every spoonful. Some relief foods were unfamiliar, and households had to learn what to do with them. A commodity is not a meal until someone cooks it into one. That step, again, fell on the kitchen. The government might provide flour. It did not knead the dough at 5 a.m, watch the stove, slice the loaf, decide who got the end piece, and save the crumbs. Kitchens also absorbed people. During the Depression, households often expanded because relatives doubled up. A brother out of work might come to stay. Grandparents might move in. A widowed aunt might arrive. Adult children might return home. Boarders might be taken in for a few dollars a week or in exchange for help. More. People under one roof meant more hands perhaps, but also more mouths. The kitchen had to stretch not only ingredients but space. More plates, more washing, more noise, more conflict, less privacy. A pot that once fed 4 now had to feed 7. Women who took in boarders often cooked for them too, turning domestic labour into income while increasing exhaustion. A boarder might make the difference between paying rent and eviction, but he also needed breakfast. The home became partly business, partly refuge, partly relief station. That blurred line was common. Economic crisis enters the body through food, but it enters relationships through dependence. Who is contributing? Who is eating more? Who is trying? Who is ashamed? Who is being carried? The kitchen hears all of it. Arguments could begin over portions, waste, money spent outside the home. a man buying tobacco when children needed milk, a child sneaking food, a relative not helping enough, a boarder late with payment. Hunger makes small conflicts sharper because the stakes are never only emotional. The last egg is not just an egg. It is breakfast, fairness, care and anger in a shell. Yet kitchens were also places of tenderness. A mother saving the softest part of bread for a small child. A father bringing home bruised apples and pretending they were a prize. An older sister learning to cook because her mother had taken laundry work. A neighbour sending over soup without calling it charity. Women sharing yeast starter, garden produce, canning jars, or advice about where cheaper flour could be found. Children sent with covered dishes between apartments. A churchwoman leaving a basket at the door and walking away before anyone had to say thank you face to face. Hard times did not make everyone generous, but they created many chances for generosity to matter. Food given quietly could preserve dignity better than food given publicly. That is why the covered dish is an important depression object. It carried nourishment, but it also carried tact. The giver could say it was extra. The receiver could pretend to believe that. Both understood the arrangement. Both allowed the other to remain human. There is a particular kind of intelligence in that kind of kindness. It knows that hunger hurts twice, once in the stomach and once in the pride, and it tries not to worsen the second wound while treating the first. Not every kitchen had a mother at the centre. Some men cooked because they were widowed, single, travelling, living in camps, riding rails or managing alone. Unemployed men in shanty towns made stews from whatever could be gathered or begged. The word mulligan stew became associated with hobo camps and makeshift meals, where each person contributed something if he had it. A potato, an onion, a scrap of meat, a can of tomatoes, a handful of rice, anything that could enter the pot. There was skill there too, though it was often dismissed. Men cooking outdoors in tin cans and battered pots were also inventing dinner from almost nothing. Migrant families on the road did the same beside cars in camps, along irrigation ditches, under trees, wherever a fire could be made. A mother travelling west with children might cook beans on a roadside, fry dough in a pan blackened by use, or heat canned food over a fire while dust settled on everything. The Depression kitchen was not always a room. Sometimes it was a camp stove, a fire ring, a crate used as a table, a coffee can, a skillet, and the side of a car. Hunger followed people when they moved. So did cooking. In the Dust Bowl migration, families carried utensils, sacks of flour, bedding, children, and recipes across state lines. A recipe is portable in a way furniture is not. You can lose a house and still know how your mother made biscuits. That knowledge could steady people in places where everything else was unfamiliar. At the same time, migration exposed families to new humiliations. Cooking in the open where strangers could see, feeding children in camps where sanitation was poor, trying to keep food clean when dust blew constantly, stretching meals while searching for work in fields where wages were low and competition fierce. A kitchen with walls could hide scarcity. A camp kitchen could not. The act of feeding a family became visible to neighbours, growers, relief workers, and photographers. Some of the most famous images of the Depression show mothers and children in migrant camps. But outside the frame there was often a cooking problem. What is left? Where is the water? How much fuel? Whose turn to eat? What can be saved? Water itself mattered. In cities, running water was more common but not guaranteed in every poor dwelling, and hot water could require fuel. In rural areas and camps, water might have to be carried. Cooking from scratch when hungry is already labour. Cooking from scratch when water must be hauled, fuel must be found, and children must be watched becomes a full physical burden. The phrase homemade can sound comforting now. In the Depression, homemade was often necessary, and necessary things are not automatically gentle. Bread made at home required arms, time, heat, and attention. Beans required sorting and soaking. Greens required washing. Laundry, cooking, childcare, and paid or informal work overlapped constantly. The kitchen didn't close after dinner. It had to be cleaned, prepared, and mentally reset for breakfast, if there was breakfast. Many adults began days with coffee because coffee, even weak, gave the impression of beginning. Children might have oatmeal, bread, mush, or nothing substantial. Leftover supper could become breakfast. Cornmeal mush cooked at night could be sliced and fried in the morning if there was grease. Fried mush with syrup would be pleasant if syrup existed. Without syrup, it was still food. Oatmeal could be stretched with water. Pancakes could be made without eggs if necessary, less tender but filling. Biscuits could be made with flour, baking powder if available, salt, fat if any, and water or sour milk. The variations were endless, because necessity kept changing the recipe. A depression cook often did not follow a recipe so much as negotiate with it. No eggs, less milk, more water, no butter, use grease, no sugar, use molasses, no molasses, leave it out, no meat, add beans, no beans, add potatoes, no potatoes, make gravy, no gravy, toast the bread, no bread. Wait. That last instruction, wait, appears nowhere in cookbooks, but it was part of many kitchens. Wait until relief comes. Wait until father returns. Wait until the neighbour answers. Wait until tomorrow when the grocer might extend credit. Wait until the children are asleep so adults can eat what remains or admit there is nothing. Waiting changed appetite. People drank water, tea, coffee, or nothing. Some chewed slowly. Some went to bed early. Sleep could be a way to shorten hunger, if hunger allowed sleep. Children did not always sleep. Adults did not either. A person responsible for food can lie awake planning breakfast from scraps. The mind keeps opening the cupboard even in the dark. That is a detail worth staying with. Hunger does not end when the meal ends. It continues as planning, worry, memory, and calculation. The kitchen becomes a room inside the mind. You know the amount of flour without seeing it. You know which child ate less. You know whether the beans will last. You know the grocer's expression. You know the rent date. You know the relief office hours. You know how much grease is in the jar. This knowledge is exhausting because it never finishes. A well-stocked kitchen lets the mind rest. A scarce kitchen requires constant attention. And in many depression homes, that attention was provided by women whose work was still often treated as natural rather than economic. They were not counted as unemployed in the same way when the kitchen became harder to run, but their labour increased sharply. Feeding a family with money can be work. Feeding a family without money can become a daily feat of logistics. The fact that so many did it should not make us underestimate how hard it was. It should make us ask why the work was so often invisible. When people praise depression families for making do, they sometimes skip over the person who did the making. Making do had hands. It had sore feet, burned fingers, tired eyes, and a mind that could not stop dividing portions. It had someone standing at the stove hoping the smell of onion and grease would convince the room that supper was larger than it was. It had someone eating last. Sometimes that person was a mother, sometimes a grandmother, sometimes an older sister who had become half adult too soon, sometimes a father in a camp. Whoever it was, the invention of dinner from almost nothing was not a quaint trick. It was care under strain. It was also not always successful. There were nights when there simply was not enough. We should say that plainly. Not every kitchen managed to produce a meal. Some families skipped supper. Some children went to bed hungry. Some adults went without so children could eat. Some relied entirely on relief, neighbours, or breadlines. Some became malnourished despite every effort. Resourcefulness has limits, and it is unfair to turn survival stories into proof that hardship can always be solved by cleverness. Cleverness cannot replace wages forever. It cannot make milk appear. It cannot cook food that does not exist. The Depression kitchen was inventive, but it was also evidence of failure beyond the household. Every strange substitute recipe, every thinned soup, Every saved crumb tells two stories at once, one about human skill and one about the conditions that made such skill necessary. As evening settled, the kitchen had to perform one last act. It had to present the meal. Perhaps there was a pot of bean soup, thicker than yesterday because a little flour had been stirred in. Perhaps fried potatoes with onion, perhaps biscuits and gravy, perhaps cornmeal mush, perhaps cabbage cooked with a bone until the bone had given all it could, perhaps bread and coffee, perhaps something from relief that the cook had seasoned into familiarity. The family gathered. In better times, people might have asked what was for supper. In hard times, the question could sound dangerous, so it was asked carefully or not at all. The children watched the serving, adults watched the children. Portions were distributed with an attention that could feel almost ceremonial. Everyone knew the amount in the pot. Everyone knew whether seconds were possible. A compliment could ease the room. A complaint could wound more deeply than intended. If a child said he was still hungry, the sentence might fall into silence because no one doubted it, and no one knew what to do with it. That is one of the hardest moments in a hungry kitchen, when truth is spoken and cannot be answered. The dishes afterward were washed. Leftovers, if any, were saved with care. The stove was checked, the grease jar covered, the bread wrapped, the flour sack folded. The cook looked once more at what remained, not because looking changed it, but because tomorrow had already begun in her mind. The kitchen that had invented dinner from almost nothing would be asked to do it again. Morning would ask for breakfast, school would ask for lunch, work, or the search for work, would ask for strength. The baby would ask without words. The older children would pretend not to ask, which could be worse. And this is where the story moves from the stove to the schoolroom, because hunger did not stay seated at the family table. It followed children out the door in the morning. It sat with them through arithmetic and spelling. It showed itself in lunch pails that held too little, in children who said they had forgotten food at home, in teachers who learned to recognise the difference between laziness and a body running on almost nothing, and in the quiet shame that could gather around one empty place at noon, when everyone else began to unwrap what their families had been able to send. By morning, the kitchen had already made its compromises. Whatever could be served before school had been served, and whatever could be packed for the day had been packed, if there was anything to pack at all. This is where hunger became difficult to hide, because children carried the evidence of a household's condition out into the world. Adults could avoid certain places. A father could choose a breadline across town where no one knew him. A mother could ask for relief at an office, and then return home with the door closed behind her. But a child had to go to school. A child had to sit in a room with other children. A child had to open, or fail to open, a lunch pail in front of watching eyes. And children, as every adult eventually learns, can be both innocent and merciless in the same breath. They notice things. They notice shoes. They notice smells. They notice who has a sandwich wrapped in wax paper and who has nothing but an apple bruised soft on one side. They notice who says they forgot their lunch too many times for forgetting to be believable. They notice who watches the clock before noon and who does not. In the Great Depression, hunger entered the schoolhouse carrying a stack of books, a pencil worn short, and a stomach that had learned to be quiet because asking for food at home had begun to hurt the adults. Picture a classroom in the early 1930s. The room is not warm in the way modern classrooms are warm. Heat might come from radiators if the school is in a city, and the building is fortunate, or from a coal stove in rural schools, or from whatever the district can still afford to keep burning. The desks are lined in rows scratched by years of children who came before. There is chalk dust on the ledge, a flag near the front, maps of the United States and the world, perhaps a portrait of Washington or Lincoln, and a teacher who has already learned that the lesson plan is not the only thing requiring attention. She can see the depression from her desk. She sees it in the children who arrive without coats warm enough for the weather. She sees it in boys whose trousers are too short because they have outgrown them and there is no money for new ones. She sees it in girls wearing dresses made from flour sacks, sometimes beautifully sewn, sometimes obviously hurried, the fabric clean but unmistakably repurposed. She sees it in patched elbows, cardboard slipped inside shoes, hair cut at home, faces thinner than last year, and she sees it most clearly around lunch, because hunger has a way of becoming visible when other people begin to eat. For a child, the lunch pail could become an object of pride or dread. In better times, it might have held a sandwich, an apple, a piece of cake, a boiled egg, leftover biscuits, maybe something wrapped carefully by a mother who had risen early enough to make the day feel normal. In hard times, the pail might hold bread with lard, bread with sugar if sugar could be spared, cold potatoes, a biscuit from yesterday, cornmeal mush sliced and fried if the kitchen had grease, a piece of fruit from a tree if the season allowed, or nothing at all. Some children carried empty lunch pails because leaving home without one would announce the truth immediately. An empty pail at least gave the appearance of routine until noon. The child could place it beside the desk like everyone else. The problem came later, when everyone opened theirs. That is the moment I want you to sit with for a while. Noon in a schoolroom, the rustle of paper, the smell of sandwiches, children shifting, talking, trading, comparing, complaining because children with food can still complain about food. One child unwraps thick slices of bread around meat. Another has jam. Another has an egg. Another has cookies. And then there is the child who moves slowly, who opens the pail only a little, who says he is not hungry, who says he already ate, who says his mother forgot, who says he lost it, who says anything except the sentence that would be most true. There is no lunch because there was no food to put in it. The shame of that moment could stay with a person for decades. Many adults who lived through the Depression later spoke less about hunger as pain and more about hunger as exposure. The body could ache, yes, but the public knowledge of it could be worse. Children did not have the vocabulary of social failure, but they felt it. They knew when their household was being revealed. They knew when their mother's careful work to keep things respectable had failed in a visible way. They knew when other children stared. They knew when kindness itself could embarrass them. A teacher giving a sandwich quietly might save a child from hunger and still make the child burn with humiliation, because being helped means being seen. That is one of the cruelest arrangements of poverty. The help that keeps you going can also confirm what you were trying to hide. Teachers became some of the earliest witnesses to child hunger because they saw patterns parents could not hide forever. A child who had no breakfast did not always misbehave. Sometimes the child became too still. He stared through arithmetic as if numbers were written underwater. She laid her head on her arm and said she was tired. A boy who once ran at recess began sitting on the steps. A girl who had read well stumbled over words because concentration requires fuel too. Teachers saw children faint, grow dizzy, become irritable, cry easily, fight over scraps, or stop growing as expected. They saw lunch disappear from pails. They saw children linger near others who had more. They saw children volunteering to clean boards or carry supplies if there was any chance of being near a kitchen, a teacher's desk, or a place where food might appear. Hunger in a child is not only a stomach problem, it becomes behaviour, attention, posture, and silence. Some teachers responded with practical tenderness. They brought food from home when they could. They arranged with local churches or women's clubs to provide milk, soup, or sandwiches. They pretended a child had earned a snack by helping with an errand. They kept crackers in drawers. They made sure leftovers from a school event found their way to the children who needed them most. In many places, teachers were not wealthy themselves. Their salaries might have been cut. Some were paid late. Some lived in boarding houses, sent money to relatives, or supported families of their own. Still, many of them gave what they could because it is difficult to teach a hungry child and more difficult still to ignore one. A teacher could stand at the front of the room and recite geography, but if half the class was thinking about lunch, geography had competition. School lunches existed before the Great Depression in some cities and reform-minded communities, but the crisis gave them a new urgency. Earlier school lunch efforts had often been tied to ideas about public health, immigrant children, nutrition, and progressive reform. Reformers had already argued that children could not learn properly without decent food, and that schools were logical places to reach them. But during the Depression, the need became larger and more immediate. Local groups organised hot lunches where they could. Women's clubs, parent-teacher associations, church groups, settlement houses and charities helped supply food. In some schools, children paid a small amount if they could, and those who could not pay were fed through quiet arrangements. Later, federal relief and surplus food programs helped expand school meals in many communities, especially when government purchases of surplus agricultural products could be directed toward feeding children. That development matters because it shows how hunger linked the farm and the classroom. Farmers had food they could not sell at a fair price. Children needed food their families could not buy. A broken economy had separated supply from need, and relief programs tried, imperfectly, to join them again. But inside the school, the politics of relief became very simple. Was there soup today? Was there milk? Was there bread? Could a child eat without everyone knowing he was poor? Those questions shaped the daily experience more than any official language. A school lunch might be a bowl of vegetable soup, beans, cocoa, milk, bread, stew, cereal, or whatever could be made from donated goods and surplus supplies. The food was rarely fancy. It did not need to be. A hot bowl at noon could change the whole afternoon. A child who had been dull and quiet might revive after eating. A teacher could see the difference in real time. The room itself changed when children had food. Tempers eased, lessons moved, bodies settled. There is a simple physical truth here that adults sometimes forget when speaking about education in grand terms. Before a child can think about spelling, history, arithmetic, or citizenship, the child has to be able to sit upright without fighting hunger. Food is not an extra in a school. In hard times, it becomes part of the lesson before any lesson begins. The shame remained, though. A school meal could help, but it could also mark children if handled carelessly. Some schools separated paying children from non-paying children. Some used tickets, lists, or visible arrangements that made need obvious. Others tried to protect privacy. The difference mattered. A child could remember not only being fed, but how it was done. Was the bowl handed across with warmth or with impatience? Was everyone eating the same thing, or did relief children receive something different? Did the teacher say anything in front of the class? Did other children know? The emotional design of charity can stay in memory as strongly as the charity itself. A sandwich given quietly can become a lifelong memory of kindness. A meal given with contempt can become a lifelong memory of humiliation. Children also carried hunger into school through their clothes, and clothing shaped how they were treated. Flour sack dresses are often remembered today with a kind of admiration, and there is reason for that. Many feed and flour companies eventually printed sacks in patterns because they knew women were using them for clothing, curtains, towels, and quilts. A skilled mother could turn a sack into a dress so neat and pretty that the origin of the cloth almost disappeared. But not every garment could hide its beginnings. A child might know that the pattern on her dress had once held flour or feed. She might know other children knew it too. Boys wore patched overalls, handed-down shirts, shoes repaired until there was little original shoe left. In rural areas, many children came barefoot when weather allowed, which might have been normal in some communities before the Depression but still marked poverty in others. A child might miss school because there were no shoes, or because the only warm coat had to be shared with a sibling. Hunger and clothing were connected because both came from the same household shortage. A family that could not buy enough food could not easily buy socks, soles, buttons, cloth, or soap. Soap matters in this story more than people expect. Cleanliness was a form of dignity, and poor families often fought hard to maintain it. A mother might wash clothes by hand, scrub children, mend, press, and brush garments, so the family did not look as poor as it felt. But soap cost money. Hot water cost fuel. Laundry took time and strength. In crowded homes where relatives had moved in, keeping children clean became harder. A hungry child in dirty clothes faced a double judgment at school. Teachers might understand, but other children could be cruel. The schoolyard has always had its own ranking system. Poverty gives children material to use against one another, even when many of them are poor themselves. A lunch pail, shoes, a coat, the smell of unwashed wool, a biscuit made from relief flour, all of these could become evidence in the social court of childhood. At the same time, children formed their own systems of sharing. Not all memories are harsh. Some children split sandwiches, traded without making a show of charity, saved an apple for a friend, or claimed they did not want something so another child could take it. Older siblings protected younger ones. A girl might give her brother part of her lunch because he was smaller. A boy might pretend to be full because his sister looked pale. Children learned the household habit of self-denial and carried it into school. That can sound noble, but it is also a burden. A child should not have to calculate who needs food more, yet many did. Hunger made children watchful, and watchful children often become old in certain ways before their bodies catch up. There were also children who worked instead of staying in school. The Depression disrupted education for many families. Some children left school early to earn money, help at home, care for younger siblings, work in fields, sell newspapers, shine shoes, scavenge coal, pick crops, run errands, or take whatever small jobs were available. Compulsory schooling laws existed, but enforcement varied, and necessity pushed families into decisions they might not have made otherwise. An older boy might leave school because his father was unemployed and any coins mattered. A girl might stay home because her mother took in laundry and needed help with the younger children. Farm children had always combined school and work, but hardship intensified the pressure. Education became one more thing weighed against hunger. A school day had value, but so did a day's earnings, a basket of picked fruit, a bucket of coal gathered from beside railroad tracks, a line held at a relief office, or a younger child kept safe while adults searched for work. The cost of hunger was not only the missed meal, it was the future narrowed by present need. Children on the road faced a different version of this. During the Depression, thousands of young people left home, some with permission, some without, some because they believed one less mouth would help the family, some because home had already broken under pressure, some because they were searching for work, adventure, or escape. Boys and some girls rode freight trains, slept in hobo jungles, begged, worked short jobs, and learned to navigate danger. Hunger was their constant companion. A teenager might leave with a few biscuits in a pocket, and soon learn the geography of missions, rail yards, orchards, and back doors where food might be obtained. Some wrote home when they could. Some sent money. Some disappeared into the movement of the decade. It is easy to romanticize the road because photographs and songs can make it seem open and restless. But a hungry child on a freight train was not living a ballad. He was cold, dirty, at risk from accidents, violence, police, older men, illness, and the simple problem of where the next meal would come from. Many left because staying had become unbearable, not because the road was kind. Younger children, the ones who stayed in the home and the schoolroom, often understood more than adults wanted them to. They heard arguments after bedtime. They saw mothers count coins. They saw fathers come home defeated. They knew when the landlord came. They knew when furniture disappeared. They knew when a neighbour brought food and everyone pretended it was extra. They might not understand banks, tariffs, crop prices, industrial production, or federal relief policy. But they understood the emotional weather of the household. Children are expert readers of adult fear. They know when a room changes before words explain why. During the Depression, many children learned to measure safety by the pantry, the coal bin, the rent envelope, and the look on a parent's face at the end of the day. The lunchroom could either deepen that fear or soften it. A well-run school meal gave children a place where food arrived predictably, at least on school days. Predictability is not a small thing. If home was uncertain, a daily bowl of soup or cup of milk at school could become an anchor. Children might look forward to school not because they loved reading, though some did, but because school offered heat, order, and food. A teacher might become associated with nourishment in the most literal sense. That kind of memory can be tender. A child who remembers being fed by a teacher remembers more than calories. He remembers that someone outside the family noticed and acted. In a time when parents often felt they were failing, outside kindness could be complicated but deeply important. Parents sometimes felt conflicted about school meals. They wanted their children fed. They also wanted to be the ones who fed them. That distinction matters. Accepting that a school, charity, or government program must feed your child can feel like relief and grief at the same time. A mother might be grateful that her daughter received milk at school and ashamed that she could not provide it herself. A father might resent the need while still asking whether the school lunch was enough. The child might sense that mixed emotion and learn not to speak too happily about the meal, because happiness about outside food could wound the home. Hunger creates strange loyalties. A child may protect a parent's pride by hiding how much relief helped. A parent may protect a child's spirit by pretending not to notice that the school has become part of the family's food supply. School nurses and public health workers saw the physical side of child hunger more formally. They weighed children, inspected teeth, looked for signs of malnutrition, illness, poor eyesight and fatigue. Public health had been growing as a field before the Depression, and the crisis made its importance visible. A child who lacked proper food was more vulnerable to disease. In crowded or poorly heated homes, illness spread more easily. A cough could linger. A minor infection could become serious. Dental problems could go untreated. Glasses might be needed but not purchased. Hunger rarely travels alone. It brings cold, poor sleep, stress, and delayed care with it. Schools became places where these problems surfaced because children gathered there in numbers and because teachers and nurses could compare one child to another. Poverty that might be hidden in separate homes became visible when 30 children sat in the same room. The emotional effects were harder to measure but just as real. Some hungry children became anxious around food. Some hoarded. Some ate too quickly when food appeared, afraid it might be taken or might not come again. Some became ashamed of appetite itself. Others became bold, stealing from lunch pails or stores because need overran fear. A child caught stealing food might be punished as a thief when the deeper story was hunger. That does not make the act harmless, especially to another poor child whose lunch was taken, but it complicates the judgment. The Depression created situations where children acted out scarcity in visible ways. Adults had to decide whether to see misbehaviour only, or the conditions underneath it. Good teachers often learn to ask different questions, not simply, why? Are you lazy? Why are you fighting? Why did you take that? But when did you last eat? There is a small, painful scene repeated in many forms across these years. A child sits at a desk. The teacher asks the class to begin work. The child looks down. The page blurs, not from tears necessarily, but from fatigue. The stomach has been empty too long. Nearby, another child has a lunch pail with the smell of egg salad, ham, peanut butter, jam, cheese, or something simple but unreachable. The hungry child thinks about noon and also fears noon. Before noon, there is hope that hunger can be ignored. At noon, the difference between children becomes public. The clock moves slowly. When lunch finally comes, the child may leave the room, pretending to use the privy or washroom to avoid the moment of having nothing. Or the child may sit with the empty pail and perform the small theatre of already having eaten. Children became actors in these years. They acted full. They acted unconcerned. They acted as if the holes in shoes did not matter. They acted as if they did not hear other children. The performance itself was tiring. Some communities tried to make school meals universal enough to reduce stigma. If all children received the same soup or milk, then the poorest child was less exposed. That idea would become important later in the history of school lunch policy, but during the Depression, resources were uneven. Some schools could provide meals, others could not. Some had kitchens, others improvised. Rural one-room schools might have children bring ingredients for a shared pot, or a teacher might heat soup on the stove. In winter, children sometimes brought jars or containers of food from home to warm near the school stove if they had food to bring. A child with nothing to warm felt the absence in another way. Rural poverty had its own schoolroom signs, long walks in bad weather, children arriving cold, lunches of cornbread, cold biscuits, sweet potatoes, molasses, fatback, or nothing. Bare feet in seasons when bare feet were no longer carefree. In tenant and sharecropper communities, school attendance might be irregular because children were needed in the fields, or because hunger, distance, clothing, and discrimination all stood between the child and the classroom. Race-shaped school hunger sharply. Segregated schools for black children, especially in the South, were often underfunded, with shorter terms, poorer buildings, fewer supplies, and less access to public support. Black teachers, churches, and communities did enormous work to educate and feed children under conditions that white officials frequently neglected. A hungry black child's school might have fewer resources to respond, even when need was obvious. Mexican-American children in segregated or unequal schools face similar patterns of underinvestment and prejudice in many regions. Native children's experiences varied widely, including reservation schools and federal boarding schools, where food, discipline, culture, and control formed a different and often painful history. The Depression did not create these inequalities, but it pressed on them. When a society enters crisis, those already given less usually have less cushion. A school lunch program in one district could mean soup and milk. In another, it might mean nothing at all. Need was national, but help depended heavily on where a child lived and how that child was valued by the systems around them. And yet children found ways to create normal life inside the hardship. They still played. They still made jokes. They still passed notes, chased one another, memorized songs, drew pictures, whispered when they should have been quiet, loved certain teachers and disliked others, feared tests and watched the weather through windows. Hunger did not turn them into symbols every hour of the day. They were children living inside history, which means history had to compete with marbles, jump rope, baseball, spelling bees, puddles, snow, scraped knees, and the complicated politics of friendship. That is important because when we speak of depression, children only as victims, we flatten them. They were hungry, yes. Many were frightened. But they were also observant, funny, stubborn, proud, generous, jealous, embarrassed, imaginative, and alive in all the ordinary ways. A child might have no lunch and still laugh at recess. A girl in a flour sack dress might still care whether the pattern looked pretty. A boy with cardboard in his shoes might still brag about running fast. Childhood persisted, even under pressure. Food at school could become a bright spot precisely because it was shared. A pot of soup made by older girls in a domestic science room, milk distributed in small bottles, cocoa on a cold day, bread served warm if the school had a kitchen. These moments could feel almost festive to children who had been living with uncertainty. Domestic science classes themselves sometimes took on new significance. Girls learned cooking, budgeting, sewing, and household management in ways shaped by the assumptions of the time, assumptions that placed domestic responsibility heavily on future women. But the practical knowledge could be immediately useful. A girl might bring home a recipe for an inexpensive dish. She might learn how to use powdered milk, stretch flour, or prepare vegetables differently. Education and survival overlapped. The school was not separate from the household. It sent lessons home in the child's hands, and sometimes those lessons went directly into the family pot. Noon eventually ended. The pails were closed, the papers gathered, the crumbs brushed away. Children returned to lessons. For those who had eaten, the afternoon might be easier. For those who had not, the afternoon could lengthen painfully. A hungry child watches light move across a classroom differently. The mind drifts toward home, toward whether there will be supper, toward whether the father found work, toward whether the mother went to the relief office, toward whether the baby is crying, toward whether the grocer allowed credit. The school bell at the end of the day did not always release a child into comfort. It sent the child back into the household economy. Some went home to chores, some went to stand in lines, some went to sell papers, some went to gather fuel, some went to care for siblings while adults worked or searched. Some went home slowly because there was nothing waiting and no reason to hurry except cold or darkness. There is a photograph we can imagine without needing to see it. Children leaving school in the 1930s, their books tied with straps, lunch pails swinging if they had them, coats too thin, faces turned toward home. From a distance, it might look ordinary. School has ended, children are walking. But inside that ordinary movement are questions no child should have to carry so heavily. Will there be food? Will the rent be paid? Will father be there? Will mother be worried? Will there be milk for the little one? Will tomorrow's pail be empty again? This is how the Great Depression lived in children, not only as a national event, but as a series of daily uncertainties folded into the walk between school and home. Many of those children became adults who spoke of the Depression in plain sentences. We were poor, they would say. We ate what there was. We did not waste. We were hungry sometimes. The plainness can fool us. It can make the experience sound smaller than it was. But plain speech was often how people managed memory. To describe everything would require opening rooms they had spent years closing. So they gave the facts: no lunch, thin soup, flour sack clothes, teachers who helped, shame when others knew, pride when no one knew, the memory of one orange at Christmas, the taste of government cheese or relief flour, the smell of school soup, the humiliation of an empty pail. These details remained because childhood records history through objects and sensations. A child may not remember the unemployment rate, but he remembers the day his teacher gave him bread. A child may not remember which relief agency supplied the school, but she remembers the warmth of cocoa in her hands. By following hunger into the schoolroom, we see something the breadline alone cannot show. We see how economic collapse reaches people who did not cause it, cannot understand it fully, and have almost no power to change it. Children did not speculate in stocks. They did not run banks. They did not set wages, foreclose farms, close factories, or design relief policy. Yet they carried the consequences in their bodies. That is one reason child hunger disturbed so many observers then and still should disturb us now. It stripped away excuses. Whatever one believed about adult responsibility, a hungry child made the crisis morally clear. If a country could produce food and still send children to school hungry, then the problem was not merely private misfortune, it was a public failure with small faces. As the afternoon fades, the schoolhouse empties. The teacher stays a little longer, perhaps marking papers, perhaps cleaning, perhaps setting aside a few uneaten scraps because she knows who may need them tomorrow. The room grows quiet. Desks sit in rows, waiting for another morning. Outside, children are already on the roads and sidewalks, moving back toward kitchens that will once again be asked to invent supper. Some will pass bakeries, markets, fields, vacant lots, rail yards, or farms on the way. Some live in cities where food is behind glass and out of reach. Others live in places where land stretches wide around them, where barns, fields, drought, debt, and falling prices have created a different kind of hunger. Because the Depression did not only sit in classrooms with empty lunch pails, it moved through the countryside too, across tenant farms, wheat fields, cotton land, dust-covered roads, and homes where families could be surrounded by soil and still not know how they would eat through the season ahead. The schoolhouse gives us one picture of Depression hunger, but it is not the whole country. It would be easy to keep our attention on the city because the city left such visible evidence behind. Breadlines could be photographed. Men sleeping in parks could be counted. Soup kitchens could be described by reporters who could stand on a sidewalk and see the line curl around a corner. urban hunger gathered itself into scenes, rural hunger often did something quieter. It spread out. It sat miles apart in farm kitchens, tenant cabins, crossroads stores, county relief offices, churchyards, fields, barns and houses set back from roads where no photographer happened to stop. It could be just as severe, but it did not always announce itself in a crowd. A family could be hungry with acres around them. A child could walk past a field and still have little for supper. A farmer could raise food and still lose the farm. That is one of the hardest parts of depression hunger to understand, because it seems at first as if land should protect people. Soil, animals, gardens, barns, wells, orchards, smokehouses, root cellars, all of that looks like security from a distance, and sometimes it was. Rural families who owned land outright, had a garden, kept animals, preserved food, and had relatives nearby could sometimes endure the depression better than city families who needed cash for every loaf, every quart of milk, every lump of coal. But many farm families did not own their land free and clear. Many were tenants, sharecroppers, or mortgaged owners. Many depended on crop prices they did not control. Many needed cash for taxes, seed, feed, tools, medicine, clothing, kerosene, coffee, sugar, salt, flour, school supplies, and debt payments. A family might have corn in a field and still not have money. They might have cotton but not food. They might have wheat that sold for too little to pay the note. They might have milk cows and still pour out milk because the price was so low that shipping it cost more than it brought back. Hunger beyond the city streets was often tied not to the complete absence of food, but to the collapse of the system that made food into a living. The farm had always been a place of risk. Weather, insects, disease, debt, markets, and machinery could decide a family's future before the family had much to say about it. In the 1920s, before the stock market crash, many American farmers were already in trouble. During the First World War, demand for American crops had been high, prices had risen, and farmers had been encouraged to produce more. Some bought more land, some borrowed for tractors or equipment, some expanded because the market seemed to reward expansion. Then, after the war, prices fell, debt remained, land values dropped. A farm that looked like progress in 1918 could look like a trap a decade later. By the time the broader depression arrived, many rural families had already been living inside their own depression for years. The crash did not start their trouble. It deepened it, spread it, and made escape harder. When crop prices dropped to terrible levels, the numbers could become almost absurd. Corn could be worth so little in some places that farmers burned it for fuel because it was cheaper than coal. Hogs could bring prices so low that the work of raising them barely made sense. Cotton prices fell hard, and for families tied to cotton, especially in the South, that fall was not an economic statistic. It was clothing not bought, flour not purchased, a doctor not called, rent or debt unpaid, and meals reduced to what could be grown or credited. Wheat farmers watched prices fall too, and in the plains, that financial blow met an environmental disaster that made everything worse. The Dust Bowl was not the whole Great Depression, and not every hungry rural family lived in the Dust Bowl, but the dust became one of the most powerful images of what it meant for land itself to seem to turn against the people depending on it. In parts of Oklahoma, Texas, Kansas, Colorado, and New Mexico, drought, high winds, and farming practices that had removed native grasses helped create storms of soil so thick that day could look like night. Dust came through cracks around windows and doors. It settled on beds, plates, tables, babies, bread dough, water buckets, and lungs. Women hung wet sheets over windows and still swept dust from the floor again and again. Men watched topsoil leave in the wind, sometimes the very soil that had been counted on to pay the bank. Children walked to school with cloths over their faces or stayed home when storms were too bad. Livestock choked, crops failed, machinery jammed. A housewife could set a table and then wipe grit from the plates before food touched them. It is hard to imagine a more direct insult to the work of keeping a household going. Even the meal, if there was one, had to be defended from the air. Hunger in a dust storm had a particular cruelty because it made the ordinary acts of cooking and eating feel exposed. Flour had to be protected from dust, water had to be covered, food had to be stored carefully. A pot on the stove could not simply be left open. A family might eat beans, cornbread, potatoes, gravy, or whatever they had, and still taste grit between the teeth. Dust pneumonia became a real fear as fine particles entered lungs and weakened bodies already underfed. The dust did not cause every hunger in the countryside, but where it struck, it joined hunger to exhaustion in a way that people remembered for life. You did not just worry about the next crop. You breathed the failure of the last one. Debt made everything sharper. A farm family could live with a little cash for a while if the land still felt secure, but when mortgage payments, taxes or store accounts came due and could not be paid, the threat was not only hunger, it was removal from the place that made survival possible. Foreclosure sales became some of the most painful rural scenes of the 1930s. A family's equipment, animals, furniture and land could be auctioned off. Neighbours sometimes gathered to resist in the way they could. At what were called penny auctions, people agreed not to bid seriously against the family. A cow might be bought for a few cents and returned. Farm machinery might be bid in low and handed back. The crowd could intimidate outside buyers into silence. These actions were not sentimental gestures, they were community defence. The neighbours understood that one family's foreclosure could be the beginning of many. Saving a neighbour's team of horses or plough was also a way of saying the market would not be allowed to strip every household one by one without resistance. But penny auctions did not save everyone. Some families lost the land, some packed what they could and moved in with relatives, some became tenants after owning, some joined the road west, some stayed physically on the same soil but no longer controlled it. Hunger after foreclosure was not only about food, it was about losing the means to produce food, losing the animals that supplied milk or meat, losing the cellar, losing the garden, losing the routines that had made scarcity manageable. Tenant farmers and sharecroppers lived with even less control. In the south, especially in cotton country, many families farmed land owned by someone else and settled accounts after the crop. The system often kept them in debt, dependent on advances from landlords or merchants and trapped by prices, interest and unfair accounting. For black sharecroppers, this system operated within a racial order enforced by law, custom, violence and economic pressure. A bad crop or low price could mean hunger, but so could a landlord's decision, a merchant's ledger, or a local official's prejudice. Poor white tenants suffered under debt too, but black families faced additional barriers in relief, credit, legal protection, and mobility. During the Depression, when cotton prices collapsed, the hunger of sharecropping families became severe in many areas. Some relied on cornmeal, molasses, fatback when available, greens, peas, sweet potatoes, and whatever could be hunted, gathered, grown, or borrowed. Diets could be monotonous and inadequate. Children worked, school attendance suffered, clothing wore out, medical care was delayed or impossible, and because much of this suffering happened in rural cabins far from major newspapers, it could be treated by the wider country as background poverty rather than emergency. That is another important point. The Depression made hunger visible, but some hunger had been there before. For many black families, indigenous communities, Mexican-American workers, poor white tenants, migrant labourers, and isolated rural people, the 1930s intensified conditions rooted in older inequalities. The crash was not the first time they had been hungry. It was the moment when hunger became too widespread for the nation to ignore completely. In the countryside, one of the strangest contradictions was that some people destroyed or reduced production while others needed food. The Agricultural Adjustment Act, passed in 1933, tried to raise farm prices by paying farmers to cut production. The idea was that overproduction had driven prices down, and reducing supply would help farmers earn enough to survive. In economic terms, officials could explain it. In human terms, it was hard to watch. Cotton was ploughed under, piglets were slaughtered, crops were reduced while people stood hungry. Many Americans were angered by the sight, or even the idea of food and crops being destroyed during a time of need. The policy did help some farm owners by raising prices, but its benefits were uneven. Tenants and sharecroppers could be displaced when landowners took acreage out of production. Some landlords kept payments and pushed workers off the land. A program intended to save farming could deepen hardship for people at the bottom of the rural system. This is why rural depression history cannot be told as one simple story of government help, arriving and hunger ending. Relief and reform mattered, but the results depended on power. Who owned the land? Who controlled the check? Who was allowed to apply? Who could complain safely? Who was considered worth saving? A farm family's kitchen reflected all of this. In some homes there was a garden, a cow, chickens, a smokehouse, preserved vegetables, and enough knowledge to get through lean seasons, though with strain. In others, especially among tenants or migrants, there might be very little beyond meal, beans, a little grease, and hope for credit. Women in rural homes did the same kind of stretching city women did, but with different materials. Cornbread could appear at nearly every meal. Biscuits if flour was available. Beans cooked with a small piece of pork or without it. Greens gathered from fields or ditches if someone knew what was edible. Sweet potatoes baked in ashes or boiled. Molasses as sweetener. Milk if there was a cow and feed enough to keep her producing. Eggs if hens were laying and the eggs did not need to be sold. Butter if there was cream to churn and no better use for selling it. Everything depended on the household economy. A child might look at chickens in the yard and still not eat eggs because eggs could bring cash at the store. A family might milk a cow and sell the cream while children drank skimmed milk or none. Food had market value, and market value could pull it away from the table. That is a difficult thing to grasp if we think of farms as places where food naturally stays with the people who produce it. Sometimes it did. Sometimes it had to be sold to keep the farm itself. In the plains, where drought stripped away gardens and crops, families used every strategy they could. They canned in good years and opened the jars in bad ones. They ate jackrabbit, wild greens, beans, cornbread, potatoes when available, and relief supplies when those arrived. Jackrabbit drives became grim community events in some places, partly pest control and partly food gathering, though they were also brutal scenes that showed how desperate the relationship between people, animals, crops and hunger had become. Men and boys hunted rabbits because rabbits ate what little vegetation remained, and because meat mattered. Rabbit stew could feed a family, but needing the rabbit did not make the scene easy. Depression survival often involved tasks that people did not later describe with pride because the memory was too harsh. Dust Bowl families also dealt with isolation. A city-hungry person might stand in a line, ashamed but surrounded by others in the same condition. A farm family might be alone with its need. The nearest neighbour could be a mile away or more. Roads could be poor. Storms could cut off travel. A county relief office might be far, and getting there might require gasoline a family could not spare. When relief did arrive, it could be irregular or insufficient. Flour, beans, canned meat, clothing, feed, or work programs helped many, but the timing mattered. Food that arrives next week does not feed a child tonight. Rural relief also carried stigma. Families who had thought of themselves as independent producers now had to ask for help. Farmers who had fed others now needed groceries. That reversal could be humiliating. The American farm ideal carried strong ideas about self-reliance, ownership, and dignity. To be hungry on a farm was not only physically painful, it could feel like a contradiction of identity. If a farmer cannot feed his family, who is he? If a mother with a garden, stove, and years of skill cannot put enough on the table, what has failed? The honest answer is that the system around them failed in many cases. But shame rarely waits for honest analysis. Shame enters first. It sits at the table before the explanation arrives. Migration became the answer for some, though it was not an easy answer and often not a chosen one in the way the word choice suggests. Families from the southern plains and other hard-hit areas loaded cars and trucks with bedding, tools, cooking pots, children and whatever could be carried. They headed toward California or other places where rumours of work travelled back along roads and through relatives. The image of the loaded car has become almost as central to Depression memory as the breadline. Mattresses tied on top, pots hanging, children squeezed among bundles, a mother holding a baby, a father driving with the fixed expression of a man who cannot afford to doubt the road he is on. But leaving did not end hunger. It changed its location. Migrant families found overcrowded camps, low wages, hostility from locals, and work that appeared and disappeared with crops. Fruit, cotton, peas, lettuce and other harvests required labour, but growers could pay little when workers were desperate and plentiful. A family might pick food all day and still struggle to buy enough to eat. That fact has a bitter edge. Hands that gathered abundance did not necessarily own any of it. Children in migrant camps saw fields of produce and still ate thin meals cooked over fires or camp stoves. Mothers protected food from dust, flies and spoilage. Water might be unsafe or far away. Sanitation could be poor. Illness spread. The road had promised work, not comfort, and often delivered too little of even that. Government camps established by the Farm Security Administration later offered some migrant families cleaner water, sanitation, and a measure of order and dignity, but there were never enough spaces for everyone. Many migrants lived in makeshift camps along ditches, roadsides, and fields. Their kitchens were temporary by necessity. A skillet, a coffee pot, a sack of flour, beans, maybe lard, maybe potatoes, maybe whatever could be bought after the day's picking. The woman cooking had to make a meal without the supports of a stable home. No proper pantry, no reliable stove, little storage, little privacy, and constant uncertainty about the next move. She might cook with children watching and dust blowing, while her husband calculated wages that had already been partly spent on gasoline or food credit. If the family had come from a farm, they may have once had a smokehouse, cellar, chickens, a garden, neighbours and routines. Now they had a car, a tent, a roadside fire, and the hope that tomorrow's field would hire them. Hunger on the road was not just lack, it was instability. Even food was harder to manage because there was nowhere safe to keep much of it. Rural children carried the burden in their own ways. Some attended school irregularly or not at all. Migrant children might enter a school for a few weeks and leave when the harvest moved. They were often mocked for their clothes, accents, poverty, or origins. Children from Oklahoma and surrounding states were called names in California, treated as outsiders, and sometimes assumed to be dirty or ignorant. Hunger, movement, and social rejection became tangled. A child who had already lost a home now had to sit in a classroom where others knew he came from a camp. Lunch could be humiliating there too. So could the smell of smoke in clothing, the dust in hair, the lack of shoes, the tiredness from fieldwork before or after school. Some migrant children worked beside parents, picking crops with small hands because every pound counted. Childhood became seasonal labour. Hunger determined attendance as much as any school rule. The landscape itself shaped what could be eaten. In the South, families might depend on greens, cornmeal, peas, sweet potatoes, pork when available, and foraging. In Appalachia, gardens, corn, beans, potatoes, hunting and preserving helped some families survive, though mining layoffs and poor land made hunger severe in many communities. In the upper Midwest, dairy farmers might have milk but no money, potatoes but no cash, oats, garden produce, and winter stores that could run low before spring. Fishing communities might have fish but face market collapse. Everywhere, the relationship between subsistence and cash was complicated. A family could eat something and still be in danger because taxes, debts, Medicine and clothing could not be paid in soup. The farm table might look better than the city table on one day and worse on another. A city child might get school milk from a program while a rural child had none. A farm child might eat fresh eggs while a city child could not. Then the farm might lose the flock, the cow might go dry, the crop might fail, and the comparison would reverse. The depression was uneven not only between city and country, but from season to season and family to family. Weather made rural hunger especially uncertain. A good garden could soften a bad year. A drought could take away the garden and the field together. Too much rain could rot crops. A late frost could kill fruit. Grasshoppers could strip plants. A sick animal could remove milk. A broken piece of equipment could delay planting or harvest when money for repairs did not exist. City poverty depended heavily on wages and prices. Rural poverty depended on those too, but also on the sky, soil, insects, animals, and timing. This made planning both essential and fragile. Women preserved food when they could because winter was not negotiable. Men repaired tools because buying new ones was impossible. Children gathered berries, nuts, greens, fuel, or anything useful. Families watched clouds with economic attention. Rain was not just weather. It was food, debt, and survival falling or failing to fall from the sky. The sound of wind in Dust Bowl country could become a warning in itself. If the wind rose and the soil moved, it meant more than inconvenience. It meant another layer of the farm leaving, another cleaning, another ruined meal, another day when livestock and children suffered, another reason to wonder whether staying was courage or stubbornness. Many families did stay, and we should not treat leaving as the only rational response. Leaving required resources too: a vehicle, fuel, strength, information, and willingness to face uncertainty. Some were too poor to leave. Some had older relatives. Some could not abandon debts or graves or land that had been in the family. Some believed next year would be better because farming always requires belief in next year. Hope on a farm is practical. You plant because you assume a future harvest, even if the last one failed. The Depression tested that habit brutally. Relief work programs changed rural life for some families. Road building, soil conservation, public works, reforestation, school construction, and other projects provided wages to men who had been trapped between failed farms and absent jobs. The Civilian Conservation Corps gave young men work, food, clothing, and a small wage, much of which was sent home to families. That money could mean groceries, taxes, or relief from one more mouth at the table. Soil conservation programs tried to address some environmental causes of erosion. Rural electrification later brought electricity to many farm homes, though not instantly and not everywhere, changing domestic labour in ways that would have seemed remarkable to families who had cooked and washed under older conditions. But these developments came unevenly and over time. In the hungry years, the immediate question remained plain: what is there to eat today, and what can be kept for tomorrow? That question did not sound very different in a tenant cabin, a Dust Bowl farmhouse, a migrant camp, or an Appalachian mining town, even though the surroundings differed. In each place, the meal represented the whole structure around it: land ownership, crop prices, weather, race, credit, relief policy, family labour, and local community all met in the pot. A thin stew was not just a thin stew. It was the final result of rainfall, debt, market failure, labour, and a cook's skill. A biscuit made from relief flour carried the federal government, the county office, the wheat market, the grocer, and the mother's hands into one small piece of food. History does not always announce itself at the table, but it is there. It sits in what can be served and what cannot. There is a scene from rural Depression life that explains more than a chart can. A family wakes before dawn because farm work begins early even when times are bad. The mother starts a fire or lights the stove if there is fuel. Breakfast may be cornmeal mush, biscuits, leftover beans, coffee or milk if there is milk. The father checks animals or walks the fields, knowing already that the crop may not pay. Children do chores before school or before field work. Dust lies on the windowsill or frost on the ground, depending on the region. The family owns little cash. At the store, the account is high. The merchant has been patient, but not endlessly patient. There is talk of a county relief order, but it requires going into town. There is talk of a neighbour losing land. There is talk of a government programme that may help, though no one is sure how or when. Dinner will be whatever can be made from what remains. The family is not idle. They are surrounded by work. That is what makes the hunger so hard to accept. Everyone is working, and still the table is uncertain. The old moral equation says work should produce security. Rural depression hunger showed that work could be everywhere and security nowhere. In the evening, the fields darken. A city breadline has a closing hour, a school lunch has a noon bell, but farm worry follows the light down and remains after dark. The cow must be milked if there is a cow, tools put away, water carried, supper prepared, dust swept again, children brought in, a lamp lit if kerosene can be spared. The meal may be plain, but it is served with the same effort to preserve family order that we saw in the city kitchen. People eat what there is. They speak of weather, prices, neighbours, work. Maybe the road west, maybe the bank, maybe nothing, because silence is sometimes easier. Outside, the land that was supposed to feed them lies in darkness. It may feed them again. It may fail again. It may be taken. That uncertainty was the rural version of standing in line before dawn. Instead of waiting outside a mission door, the family waited on rain, prices, relief, harvest, and the decisions of men in banks, county offices and distant markets. Waiting still consumed them. Waiting still shaped appetite. Waiting still made children listen too closely to adult voices. Hunger beyond the city streets was less visible, but it was not less organised by fear. It lived in croplands, unpaid taxes, dust storms, empty barns, failed gardens, thin livestock, relief flour, and cars loaded for departure. It lived in the anger of farmers who watched prices fall below survival. It lived in the shame of asking for help after years of feeding oneself. It lived in the irony of destroying crops to raise prices while people needed food. It lived in the hands of migrants picking harvest they could barely afford to eat. And it lived in the memory of families who would later keep pantries full, save seed, distrust debt, watch the weather, and teach children never to laugh at a person with nothing on the table. As night settles over the rural road, the city is still there with its lines and missions. The schoolroom is still there with its empty lunch pails, and the farm is still there with its dust, debt, and stubborn work. These were not separate histories. They belong to the same national hunger, seen from different windows. What connected them was the lesson millions learned in different ways. Enough is not guaranteed. Enough can vanish through a layoff, a bank failure, a drought, a price collapse, a closed store account, an illness, a foreclosure, or a road that leads away from home. And once people learned that, they did not easily forget it. The body remembers hunger, but families remember it too, in recipes, habits, warnings, full cupboards, saved jars, careful spending, and the strange comfort some people felt for the rest of their lives when they could look at a pantry shelf and see that, at least for tonight, there was something there. The hunger did not end the moment a man found work again, and it did not end the moment a family could put meat on the table for the first time in months. That is one of the most important things to understand about the Great Depression. A crisis can end on paper before it ends inside the people who lived through it. Government reports can show employment improving. Factory whistles can begin blowing again. Fields can recover after rain returns. Relief rolls can shrink. Stores can reopen. But a mother who has spent years measuring flour by fear does not suddenly become careless with flour because the national mood has improved. A child who has sat at school with an empty lunch pail does not forget the feeling because he has grown and the pantry is full. A father who stood in a breadline before dawn does not necessarily speak of it later, but he may still arrive early for everything, keep cash hidden in the house, distrust debt, and never sit comfortably with an empty cupboard. Hunger leaves through the door, but it also stays in the habits. It stays in the way bread is wrapped, in the way leftovers are saved, in the way jars are washed and kept, in the way a person says, there is still good food on that plate, with a seriousness that children born later may not understand. For many Americans who lived through the 1930s, enough became a different word. Before hunger, enough might have meant comfort, choice, a little variety, a Sunday roast, a full coal bin, milk for the children, and the ability to buy what was needed without asking anyone's permission. After hunger, enough could mean something more guarded. Enough meant the rent was paid this month. Enough meant flour on the shelf. Enough meant beans in a sack, potatoes in the bin, jars in the cellar, coal for the stove, work for another week, and a little money not yet spoken for. Enough meant not having to explain need to a relief officer. Enough meant the children could take lunch to school without inventing an excuse. Enough meant that no one at the table had to say they were not hungry when everyone knew they were. That change in meaning was not small. It shaped families long after the official emergency had passed. The 1930s did not end in one clean motion. Recovery was uneven, and for many households it came slowly. New Deal programs brought wages, relief, food distribution, public works jobs, conservation work, farm programs, and a new idea that the federal government had some responsibility when private markets failed on a massive scale. The Works Progress Administration put millions to work on roads, schools, parks, bridges, public buildings, art, writing projects, and local improvements. The Civilian Conservation Corps sent young men to camps where they received food, clothing, shelter, and wages, with much of the pay sent home to families who needed it. Federal emergency relief helped states and localities provide direct aid. Agricultural programs tried to raise farm prices, though often unfairly and unevenly, especially for tenants and sharecroppers. Surplus food efforts connected some farm products to hungry families and children, though never perfectly. Later, the first food stamp program began in 1939 as a way to help low-income people buy food, while also moving farm surpluses. These changes mattered. They did not erase hunger, and they did not reach every person equally, but they changed the national argument. Before the Depression, hunger was often treated as a local problem, a family problem, a charity problem, or a failure of individual responsibility. After millions of willing workers could not find work, after children went to school hungry in towns that still had stores full of food, after farmers lost land while crops had no value, the old explanations sounded thinner. Not everyone accepted the new thinking, but the country had seen too much to pretend that private character alone could solve public collapse. The greatest shift may have been in the way people understood security. The Depression taught ordinary families that wages could vanish, banks could close, land could be lost, crops could fail, prices could collapse, and food could become unreachable, even in a country capable of producing it. That lesson entered public policy in practical ways. Social Security, created in 1935, did not feed every hungry family during the worst early years, and it excluded many workers at first, including large numbers of domestic and agricultural labourers. But the idea behind it reflected a broader recognition that old age, unemployment and poverty could not be left entirely to chance, family charity, or local relief. Unemployment insurance, labour protections, work relief, food assistance, school lunch efforts, and later welfare and nutrition programs all grew in a country marked by the memory of mass hardship. These programs were debated, limited, fought over, expanded, restricted, and reshaped across decades. but the depression remained underneath the debate as evidence. People had seen what happened when there was no floor under a family. They had seen pride collapse into hunger, and hunger become a public emergency. The memory of breadlines and empty lunch pails made it harder to argue that nothing should be done. Inside families, the lessons were even more personal. Many people who survived depression hunger became careful in ways that later generations sometimes found excessive. They saved bacon grease in jars long after they could afford cooking oil. They folded used wrapping paper. They kept rubber bands, string, foil, buttons, nails, coffee cans, and cloth scraps. They reused envelopes. They watered soup not because they had to anymore, but because it seemed wrong not to stretch it. They kept a garden even when grocery stores were full. They canned tomatoes, peaches, beans, pickles, applesauce, or jam, because a shelf of sealed jars made the future feel less exposed. They bought flour in larger quantities than they needed. They kept canned goods in basements and pantries. They disliked seeing children waste food. They became uneasy when younger people threw away bread heels or left meat on a plate. Sometimes their warning sounded sharp. Finish that. Do not waste. You have no idea what people went through. To the child hearing it in 1955 or 1975 or 1995, the words could sound like scolding. To the person saying them, the words came from memory. A plate with food left on it could open a door back to a time when that food would have mattered. Food habits are a kind of family archive. They do not look like documents, but they preserve history. A grandmother who always made soup from bones was not only cooking, she was carrying forward the knowledge that bones still had value. A grandfather who ate everything on his plate and never complained about leftovers was not merely old-fashioned. He may have learned as a child that complaint hurt the person who cooked from scarcity. A mother who kept extra cans under the stairs might have been storing more than peas and tomatoes. She was storing relief from a fear she never fully named. A family that saved jars, grew potatoes, bought day-old bread, or stretched meat with beans may have been repeating habits formed when those habits meant survival. These patterns could continue even after prosperity arrived, because prosperity did not erase the logic of hard times. It simply made the old logic less visible to people who had not needed it. The silence mattered too. Many depression survivors did not tell long stories about hunger. Some did, but many did not. They might answer questions with a few plain sentences. We did not have much. We ate beans. Your great-grandfather walked for work. There was no lunch sometimes. We got by. That last phrase, we got by, appears often in family memory, and it can hide an entire world. Getting by might mean children leaving school. It might mean a mother not eating enough for years. It might mean a farm lost, a house shared with relatives, a winter without proper shoes, a father gone for months looking for work, a boy riding freight trains, a girl ashamed of her flour sack dress, a family accepting relief after resisting it as long as possible. People use plain speech because plain speech kept control over the memory. To describe hunger fully would mean returning to the helplessness of it, and many people had spent the rest of their lives proving that helplessness was over. So they spoke of it in practical terms. Beans, bread, work, shoes, rent, relief, dust, lines. They did not always say fear, though fear was in the room. For those who were children during the Depression, the memory often stayed sharp around school and food. An empty lunch pail could become one of the defining images of childhood. So could the teacher who noticed. So could the first school meal that arrived without shame. Some remembered hot soup at noon as the thing that made school bearable. Others remembered pretending not to be hungry because pride had already been taught at home. A child who had been helped kindly might carry gratitude for a teacher for 70 years. A child who had been humiliated might carry that too. This is why the way help is given matters. Food solves the immediate problem of hunger, but the manner of giving shapes the memory attached to it. During the Depression, many people learned that charity could rescue and wound at the same time. A grocery basket left quietly at the door felt different from a basket handed over with questions and judgment. A school lunch served to everyone felt different from a marked meal for the poor. A relief order issued with respect felt different from one issued as if need itself were a crime. The food entered the body, but the treatment entered the person. The Depression also changed what many Americans expected from government, though not in one uniform direction. Some came away believing public relief had saved them or their neighbours. Others believed government programs had been too slow, too intrusive, too political, or unfairly administered. Farmers had mixed views depending on whether programs helped them keep land or push tenants away. Black Americans often saw relief filtered through racist local systems, even as federal programs sometimes offered opportunities that had not existed before. Mexican-American families remembered both hunger and repatriation pressure. Native communities experienced hardship through federal systems that had long controlled land, food, work, and education. The legacy of hunger was not one national feeling. It was many memories shaped by who received help, who was denied help, who was humiliated, and who was allowed to recover. But across those differences, the 1930s made one fact hard to ignore. Food security was not only about individual effort. It depended on wages, land, prices, transportation, schools, banks, relief offices, weather, policy, prejudice, and power. A meal on the table had more history in it than people had wanted to admit. As the economy improved, especially with the industrial build-up before and during the Second World War, many men and women who had known unemployment moved into war work, military service, factory jobs, shipyards, aircraft plants, farms, offices, and public employment. Wages returned for many families. Rationing during the war brought a different kind of food management, one based not on mass unemployment in the same way but on national mobilization and supply priorities. For people who had lived through Depression hunger, wartime rationing could feel serious but not unfamiliar. They already knew how to save grease, stretch meat, use leftovers, plant gardens, and make do. Victory gardens, ration books, scrap drives, and household conservation all drew on skills many families had practiced under harder and less patriotic circumstances. There is a difference between saving food because the government asks everyone to help win a war and saving food because your children are hungry, but the skills overlapped. The Depression had trained millions in thrift before thrift was given a flag and a slogan. Some people who had been ashamed of making do in the 1930s found those same habits praised in the 1940s. That turn must have felt strange. After the war, many Americans entered a period of prosperity that seemed to answer the Depression with abundance. Supermarkets expanded, refrigerators became common, packaged foods multiplied, suburbs grew, lunch boxes filled, meat appeared more often on tables. Children of the post-war years sometimes grew up in homes where the pantry was full, but the adults behaved as if emptiness was still possible at any moment. A grandmother might have a freezer packed tightly enough to feed a block. A father might keep a job he disliked because the memory of no job was worse. A mother might buy canned goods whenever they were on sale, not because she planned a specific meal, but because stocked shelves made her breathe easier. This is how history can live inside prosperity. The house may look modern. The kitchen may have electric appliances. The children may drink milk without thinking much about it. But the adult who opens the refrigerator may still see, behind the food that is there, the outline of the food that once was not. There is something important to notice in the way Depression survivors taught their children. Some taught caution directly. They told stories of hunger, hard work, and waste. They wanted children to understand that comfort was not guaranteed. Others avoided the subject because they wanted children to feel safe, or because the past felt too humiliating, or because they believed silence was a form of moving on. Both approaches carried consequences. Children who heard the stories sometimes felt burdened by a hardship they had not lived. Children who heard nothing sometimes misunderstood the habits around them. Why does Grandma save foil? Why does Dad get angry about wasted bread? Why does Mother worry when the cupboards are low even though payday is coming? Without the story, the habit can look irrational. With the story, it becomes evidence. That is why remembering matters. Not to trap families in old fear, but to explain the shape of care that came from it. Hunger also changed communities. Neighbourhoods that had survived through mutual aid remembered who helped and who did not. Churches that fed people during the worst years carried those stories into their identity. Teachers who had fed children understood education differently afterward. Local relief workers, nurses, settlement house staff and volunteers saw need at close range, and sometimes became advocates for broader programs because they knew charity alone could not bear the weight. Unions and labour movements gained force in part because workers understood how vulnerable they were without organisation. Farmers who had resisted foreclosure together remembered the power of neighbours acting as a group. Migrant families remembered both kindness and hostility in the towns they passed through. The Depression did not make Americans uniformly compassionate, but it created countless situations in which people had to decide what kind of neighbour they would be. Would they share seed? Would they bid at a penny auction to save a family's cow? Would they let a child eat without making him feel small? Would they extend credit one more week? Would they look away from suffering or step toward it? These decisions rarely entered national histories, but they mattered to the people who lived because of them. Some of what hunger left behind was anger. We should not smooth that away. People were angry at banks, landlords, employers, politicians, relief officials, markets, weather, and sometimes themselves. Farmers who watched land sold for debts they could not pay were angry. Men who wanted work and were told there was none were angry. Women who had to answer humiliating questions for grocery relief were angry. Black families denied fair access to aid had every reason to be angry. Migrants treated as unwanted intruders while they searched for field work were angry. Children who were mocked for poverty could grow into adults who remembered the insult more clearly than the meal itself. Anger is part of the legacy because hunger is not only sad, it is also unjust when food exists and people cannot reach it. The Depression made that injustice visible enough that it changed politics, literature, photography, music, and public language. Songs about hard times, novels about dispossession, photographs of migrant mothers, reports on malnutrition, speeches about forgotten people. All of these helped the nation see hunger not as isolated failure, but as a shared crisis. At the same time, some people remembered pride. Not pride in being hungry, but pride in surviving without surrendering the household completely. Pride in a mother who could cook from almost nothing. Pride in a father who kept looking for work. Pride in children who helped. Pride in neighbours who stood together. Pride in a garden that produced. Pride in jars sealed for winter. Pride in making a dress from a flour sack so well that it looked intentional. Pride in staying clean when soap was scarce. Pride in paying back a debt years later because it had mattered to owe it. This pride should be handled carefully. It does not mean the hardship was good. It means people found ways to preserve dignity inside hardship. There is a difference. Poverty should not be praised because some people endured it bravely. Endurance is admirable. The conditions that required it may still be wrong. Depression survivors often understood this better than later storytellers. They could be proud of getting by and still never wish those years on anyone. The meaning of enough became practical, not theoretical. Enough was the ability to feed children without apology. Enough was the ability to waste less by choice rather than by fear. Enough was being able to invite someone to the table and not panic about portions. Enough was having food for guests because hospitality had been one of the casualties of hunger. A household under strain cannot easily host. It cannot offer coffee freely, cut generous slices, send leftovers home, or say, stay for supper, without calculating. When food returned, hospitality returned too. For many families, feeding others became a way to answer the past. Grandmothers who had once had too little might later cook too much. Tables groaned at holidays not only because people liked abundance, but because abundance disproved an old terror. Extra food could become a celebration and a reassurance. A crowded table said, "Not tonight. Tonight no one is leaving hungry. Tonight there is enough, and enough can be shared." That is why holiday meals carried special weight for many Depression families. Thanksgiving, Christmas, Sunday dinners, church suppers, reunions, harvest meals, and family gatherings became more than occasions. They became proof of recovery. A turkey, ham, roast, pie, mashed potatoes with butter, green beans, rolls, coffee, cake, and children asking for seconds without fear, all of that could feel like history being answered in the language of food. But even there, the old rules remained. Leftovers saved, bones boiled, fat kept, pie wrapped, coffee poured carefully. A person who had known hunger could enjoy abundance and still refuse waste. The two feelings did not cancel each other. They lived side by side. If you look at the long arc of American food policy after the Depression, you can see the shadow of those years in school lunch programs, food stamps, commodity distribution, nutrition science, agricultural supports, unemployment insurance, and debates over poverty. The National School Lunch Act would come after the Depression and the war in 1946, but the need it addressed had been made painfully clear in the 1930s and 1940s. Leaders had seen that child nutrition affected learning, health, and even military readiness, when young men were later examined for service, and many showed signs of poor health. Food assistance programs would evolve across decades, always argued over, always shaped by politics. But the central problem remained familiar. How does a wealthy food-producing country prevent people from going hungry when wages, prices, family circumstances, or crises fail them? The Depression did not provide one permanent answer. It forced the question into the centre of American life. For the people who lived it, the answer was often less official. Keep something back. Do not trust one good year too much. Help when you can because you may need help later. Feed children first. Never laugh at a person in line. Do not waste bread. Learn to cook beans. Know how to make soup. Save seeds. Pay attention to weather. Keep your tools. Avoid debt if you can. Carry cash. Share quietly. Accept help when pride becomes dangerous. These lessons were not written together in one book, but they moved through families like an unwritten manual. Some of the lessons were wise, some were burdensome, some protected people, some made them anxious. That is how survival knowledge often works. It keeps a person alive in one world and can make the next world harder to relax in. A habit formed under threat does not always know when the threat has passed. Imagine, years later, one of those Depression children as an old person standing in a modern kitchen. There is electric light overhead. The refrigerator hums, the freezer is full. There are cans in the cabinet, bread on the counter, milk in the door, perhaps fruit from another state, coffee from another continent, and more choice in one room than many families had in a month of the 1930s. A grandchild opens the refrigerator and says there is nothing to eat because nothing looks appealing. The old person hears the sentence and feels something rise in the chest. Not only irritation, memory. The child means there is nothing desired. The old person remembers when there was nothing available. Those are different kinds of nothing, and the distance between them is the history we've been walking through. It is easy for generations to misunderstand each other across that distance. The young may see control, worry, or scolding. The old may see carelessness. Underneath both is a pantry shelf, once empty, now full, asking to be interpreted. The Great Depression did not create hunger in America, and it did not end hunger in America. Before the 1930s, many people had known chronic poverty, especially in communities pushed to the margins by race, land loss, low wages, and exclusion. After the 1930s, hunger continued in different forms, through recessions, discrimination, rural poverty, urban poverty, old age, disability, unemployment, and policy failures. But the Depression gave hunger a national visibility that changed the country's memory of itself. It showed that hunger could reach clerks, factory workers, farmers, veterans, children, widows, migrants, and families who had believed themselves secure. It showed that a modern economy could fail in ways that left millions dependent on lines, relief, and each other. It showed that dignity and need could exist in the same person at the same time, and it showed that food is never just food when it becomes uncertain. It becomes time, pride, health, learning, family peace, public policy, and memory. So when we think about life during hunger and the Great Depression, it is not enough to picture only the breadline, though the breadline matters. It is not enough to picture only the empty cupboard, though the cupboard matters. We have to see the whole chain. The job lost, the pay envelope shrinking, the bank door closed, the grocer's credit ending, the mother watering soup, the father walking home with no work, the child carrying an empty lunch pail, the teacher noticing, the farmer watching prices fall, the dust entering the house, the tenant family trapped by debt, the migrant cooking beside a road, the relief worker asking questions, the neighbour leaving food quietly, the jar of grease saved, the bread heel kept, the school soup steaming in a bowl, the first paycheck after months without one, the pantry slowly filling again, the habits remaining long after the shelves are stocked. There is one final scene worth holding. A family sits down to supper after the worst years have begun to loosen their grip. It is not a rich meal, but it is better than what came before. There is bread enough for everyone. There are potatoes, beans, maybe meat in the pot, milk for the children, coffee for the adults. No one says much about the difference because families do not always announce relief while they are feeling it. The mother serves. The father eats without pretending he is not hungry. The children ask for more, and this time there is a little more to give. That moment would not make a headline. It would not appear in a national report. But inside that house, it would matter. It would mean the family had crossed some line back toward ordinary life. Not back to innocence, because hunger had taken that. Not back to carelessness, because carelessness would no longer feel safe. But back to a table where food could be eaten without fear tightening every bite. And maybe that is what hunger left behind most deeply, a changed relationship with the ordinary. A loaf of bread was no longer merely a loaf. A bowl of soup was not merely soup. A full shelf was not merely storage. A child's lunch was not merely routine. These things had been tested by absence, and once something ordinary has been absent long enough, its return can feel almost solemn. The people who lived through the Depression knew that. They may not have said it in those words. They may have said only, "Save that," or "Eat what you take," or "We were lucky," or "We got by." But underneath those plain sentences was the memory of a country where millions learned to measure life by the next meal, and where enough, when it finally came, was never again taken quite for granted.